This page of N64 Magazine is blaring out about Lilac Wars, which everyone else in the world knew as Star Fox 64. Apparently, it's got a 10-page review stuffed with tips and secrets, which back then was proper exciting stuff if you were stuck on a level. There's a big mention of a massive blast core guide too. Seems they're explaining all the hard bits, which probably meant how to not blow yourself up all the time in that game. Looks like they were trying to stir up some competitive spirit with a Lilac Wars Championship where you could win N64 goodies. Always a good way to get us lot hyped up. Petites. Down at the bottom there are little boxes for other games. Bomberman 64 is there. Always a laugh with mates, wasn't it? Then Nagano Winter Olympics must have been getting ready for the Winter Games fever. Though those games were always a bit hit and miss, to be honest. J-League Dynamite Soccer. Bit niche for most of us, but someone must have been into it. And Top Gear Rally. Trying to be the big rally game on the N64, they were pushing that one hard. Must have. And yeah, Japanese and US news and reviews, gotta keep up with what's going on overseas, mind you. Half the time we were waiting ages to get those games over here anyway. Issue 8, November 97, £2.95 it cost you. Those were the days, eh? This page from an old N64 magazine looks like the contents page for issue 8 from November 1997. Right at the top it says contents in big red letters, can't miss that. It seems to be laying out what you'll find inside this issue of the magazine. There's a little "Welcome to N64 Magazine" blurb from the editor, Jonathan Davies. He's having a bit of a moan about Star Fox being renamed Lilac Wars for the UK. Typical Nintendo really, always messing about with names. He mentions giving away a free copy of Gentleman's Space Adventurer Quarterly and some Lilac Wars advice. Sounds like a bit of fun for the readers back then. He also mentions being disappointed with Baku Bomberman and reckons Top Gear Rally is a bit slow to start with but gets better after a while. Typical racing game really, takes a bit to get into. Boo. Then we have the main sections, N64 Arena, starting on page 32, which is all about reviewed, rated and completed games. This issue's big head-to-head is Top Gear Rally vs Multi Racing Championship. They reckon they're both fun to play, and they'll compare them ruthlessly. Well, we'll see about that, wouldn't want any punches pulled. There's a couple of small screenshots there of the games, looks like your standard racer of the time. Next up is Import Arena, starting on page 54. This section is investigating and rating the latest Japanese and American games. Always good to see what weird and wonderful stuff they were getting in Japan that we weren't. Then down the side, we have the game previews and reviews, highlighted in yellow boxes with page numbers. On page 54, there's Baku Bomberman, and it says Hudson reckons it's one of the best Bomberman formulas ever, and it's probably best if ZY explains it, so guess we'll see what ZY, or Zai as it's pronounced, thinks. There's a screenshot of the game, looks like Bomberman alright, blowing stuff up in corridors. Page 60 is J-League Dynamite Soccer, apparently it's Imagineer's turn to tackle football games. Looks like a fairly standard looking football game screenshot. Page 62 is JICU World Soccer 3, which they're calling the World Teams edition of J-League Perfect Striker. So another football game then. And lastly, on page 63 there's Mischief Makers, described as the American version of Troublemakers, and it's coming to the UK soon. Never really got into that one myself. La Negay. So, all in all, looks like a pretty standard contents page for an N64 mag from back in the day. Bunch of racing games, Bomberman and some footy games, you know, the usual. Wonder if ZY actually liked Baku Bomberman or if it was a stinker. Guess you'd have to turn to page 54 to find out. This page from N64 Magazine looks like we're in the news section, Planet 64, which is always a good place to start. We've got a few snippets about upcoming games. San Francisco Rush is mentioned, described as a different sort of racing game which is about right, a bit bonkers really. And Earthworm Jim 3D, they call it weird. No surprises there then with Earthworm Jim. There's also Nagano Winter Olympics, which they reckon should score well above 0, not exactly setting the hype train going, are they? Moving down, there's a how-to section, looks like for Blastcore. They say Jess boils his Blastcore knowledge down into 8 pages. Blastcore, that was a laugh, smashing buildings up with trucks and robots, pure Nintendo madness. Then there's a bit about winning at Mario Kart 64 Battle Mode, offering a jacket to readers who can write a good guide. Everyone thought they were a Mario Kart Battle Mode master back then, didn't they? Warrington. The big feature on this page is Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as our American cousins called it. Britain's N64 owners are let loose at last on this finest of games. Banzai. Bit dramatic, but yeah, Star Fox 64 was a big deal, proper on-rail shooter action, blasting Andros and all that. There's also something about a Lilac Wars championship, with N64 Magazine and Electronics Boutique teaming up to find the best R-Wing pilot in Europe. Sounds like a proper competition, someone probably won a t-shirt or something. Whoa! Lastly, we have the regular features like subscriptions, tips, a club, directory, back issues, and N64 Magazine issue 8 feet being called one of our rivals, cheeky sods, and a win, heaps of N64 goodies section, promising all this stuff and more, thanks to some companies called Excitement Direct and Interact. Looks like a pile of games, a steering wheel, controllers, memory packs, the usual N64 bits and bobs you'd want. Yeah, standard magazine page from back then, games, news, features, competitions, and the chance to win some stuff. Good times. This page, right then, it's a look at a new racer called San FR. Big letters there, can't miss it. San FR. It's got a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge down the side, so you know it's going for that San Francisco vibe, clearly. Seems like ZY, bless him, has been having a go on a nearly finished version of this racer. They're calling it fantastic, bit strong maybe, we'll see. The screenshots show your typical racing game stuff. Car selection screen, you've got your beginner option with a camper van. Of all things. Apparently it's slow but can take loads of damage, which, knowing my driving, might be handy. Then there's a Beetle, which they reckon is nippy, though they're not too keen on the paint job. And yeah, you can change the color of your car, how revolutionary. Gameplay shots show some colorful cars, and they mention you can smash your car around and it'll get a bit battered looking because, well, that's just racing games in it. They even say you can lay down a rubber runway as you accelerate. Sounds a bit daft, but who knows, might be fun. Overall, looks like a pretty standard arcade racer for the N64. We were getting a fair few of them around 97, weren't we? Let's just hope this fantastic new racer actually turns out to be alright when it's properly finished. This page for Planet 64 is all about San Francisco Rush. Bit of a catchy title they've gone with there, ANCISCORUSH. Very clever. It's trying to tell us to move over Steve McQueen, which I suppose means it's going for that fast-paced car chase vibe, like Bullet. There are a few screenshots dotted around. You can see the polygonal graphics which were all the rage back then, showing off some racing action, and a rather spectacular looking crash, upside down even. They're making a point about how detailed the streets are, which is fair enough. For the N64 it did look quite good at the time. Apparently, the CPU cars are hyper-aggressive, which the reviewer, or whoever wrote this, seems to like. I suppose back then, a bit of a challenge was always welcome, wasn't it? They also mention that the streets are incredibly well detailed, and call it a real achievement. Bit strong maybe, but they were probably impressed with the graphics for the time. Release-wise, it's slated for after Christmas here in the UK, but November in the US and Japan. Atari, Midway and GT are tagged as the publishers. So yeah, San Francisco Rush looked like a decent racer for the N64, one to keep an eye out for after the Christmas splurge. This page from N64 Magazine looks like we are having a gander at San Francisco Rush. It's a future look section, so we are getting a preview of what's coming. Roaring. The article, titled Short, Back and Sides, talks about the game having multiple routes, including secret shortcuts, which sounds pretty good. They mention you can explore in practice mode to find these hidden bits, like mud paths in forests or even jumping through fake walls, which sounds a bit cheeky. Apparently, there are also golden keys to collect, 6 of them in total, which unlocks a special surprise. They're being a bit coy about what that surprise is, but they reckon it's something to do with extra tracks. A bit of a Diddy Kong racing vibe, they're saying, in terms of secrets. The page has a bunch of screenshots showing off the game. You can see the city streets, which they say are treacherous, with sharp corners. There's a sequence of shots with red arrows pointing the way, showing a route through some kind of sewer system to get ahead. Clever stuff. Another bit shows a car totally flipped over, which, knowing these arcade races, is probably quite possible. Then there's a jump ramp. Outrageous jumping is what they call it, typical of San Francisco Rush. They're also saying the graphics are superb, and you can see miles ahead. Looking at the screenshots, they're decent enough for the time, chunky polygons and all, but it's all about the gameplay back then in it. This looks like it could be a laugh, especially with mates. Secret routes and surprises, sounds like it's trying to keep things interesting beyond just racing around a track. This page is all about San Francisco Rush on the N64, looks like a preview. Right then, after waiting for what seems like ages for decent driving games, suddenly we're being swamped with them, aren't we? The magazine mentions Multi-Racing Championship, Top Gear Rally, and Lamborghini 64 all vying for the serious racing crown, and even poor old F1 pole position getting a bit of stick. But San Francisco Rush is presented as something completely different, a bit more arcadey and over the top. The reviewer, Zai, reckons it has the basics of a racer but then throws in gravity-defying extras, like cloud-high leaps, mid-air collisions, and corkscrew flips. Sounds a bit mental, doesn't it? She says Atari has used San Francisco's crazy streets as the base, which makes sense with the name, and he's on about racing through the city, stretching for miles, with courses that were previously cordoned off areas in real life apparently, which is a bit dramatic. Apparently there are 8 cars, including a VW Beetle and a VW camper van, which is a bit odd for a serious racer, but maybe that's the point, a bit of fun. The tracks sound interesting, with featureless scenery and lowers mud-flecked blocks, neon signs and tower blocks, classic N64 stuff really, and the reviewer talks about shortcuts, some more impressive than others, including one where you can apparently get onto a skyscraper roof and swoop off, unharmed. Sounds a bit daft, but I suppose that's the appeal. There's a section showing 6 tracks in full, with little map pictures. Track 1 is easy, track 2 medium and track 3 hard, going up to track 6 also hard. Each has its lap distance and elevation change listed, plus the difficulty. Below are some screenshots of the game in action. The bonnet view is mentioned as being a bit stomach-churning, which is never a good sign, is it? It ends with a little note saying to be continued, and that they'll be reviewing it in December hopefully. Right then, sounds like it could be a laugh, a bit different from the usual serious races, might be worth a look when it finally comes out after Christmas. This page depicts a feature on Earthworm Jim 3D, hyping it up as an exclusive future look in N64 Magazine issue 8, must be from late '97. It's all about the latest from VIS and a fully 3D Earthworm. Remember Earthworm Jim? He was a bit of a sensation back in the 16-bit days, and here he was leaping into the N64 in 3 dimensions. The article talks about how Shiny, the original creators, were taking a backseat, and a Scottish developer called VIS Interactive were having a go at bringing Jim into the 3D world for Interplay. Apparently, Interplay just sort of stumbled into VIS's office and asked them to make the game, giving them just 2 weeks to come up with a proposal. Chris van der Koyle from VIS is quoted explaining this, and how they consult with Shiny every few months. There are a few screenshots dotted around showing Jim in his 3D blocky glory, one with some lava, and what looks like giant green marrows, with a caption about steaming great marrows and a walking green thing. The game was set to be released in winter '98 worldwide. They're even comparing it, maybe a bit optimistically, to Mario and Yoshi, calling it a genuinely scary demonstration of Dave Perry's mind, which is a bit much if you ask me. But yeah, Earthworm Jim in 3D. It was definitely something we were all keeping an eye on back then, wondering how it would actually play. This page from Planet N64, the Future Look section, is previewing Earthworm Jim 3D. It's got a big splashy title, RM Jim 3D Losing Its Head, across the top, with some very early screenshots of the game. Looks a bit rough around the edges to be honest, very N64 fuzzy, but then again it's early days. They're making a big deal about the 3D levels and the camera, saying it's a tad hyperactive, which knowing N64 cameras back then, probably means it's a right nightmare to control. There's talk about beautifully designed 3D levels which should impress old Jim at least, and mentions of using Jim's wormhead on ropes. Sounds typically bonkers Earthworm Jim, doesn't it, Jo? The article goes on about the story, something about a stray cow, and Jim ending up inside his own brain, typical really. They're saying the levels are based on ideas like fear, fantasy, happiness, physical, aggression, and childhood. Fear is horror movie themed, fantasy is a Wild West town, and happiness is all about junk food apparently, greasy treats of dreams they're calling them. Aggression is a prehistoric wasteland, and childhood is set in a fairground. Sounds like a right old mishmash, doesn't it? They are saying it's all warped areas of Jim's subconscious to try and explain it all away. Apparently the game was shown on PC at ECTS, but this preview is about the N64 version. They are saying the N64 version looks absolutely fabulous and will be the best one. Bit of hype there from reviewer Zai, pronounced Zai, bless him. They mention the developer VIS being a company with a blank CV, but they've done a good job, apparently. Chris, whoever he is, seems to be having a laugh about being taller than Dave Perry. Right at the bottom it says to be continued, so I guess there's more on this next month. It's down for release in November 1997, so hopefully it'll be a laugh when it finally comes out. This page shows a first-look article from a UK N64 magazine about the Nagano Olympics game, a new sports title for the Nintendo 64. Right then, Konami were known for their sports games, weren't they? ISS 64 was touted as the best footy game, and their other sports titles were decent enough, good for a bit of fun without being groundbreaking. The reviewer, Zai, reckons Konami's got a job on their hands to make winter sports exciting, especially downhill skiing. He mentions other winter sports games weren't always the best, like Nintendo's Winter Gold on the NES, which was alright in its day. Apparently the version shown at ECTS was suggesting good progress from Diamond Dust team, which is good to hear. The article mentions they've got the Olympic license, so you'd expect all the countries and real athletes. That's standard these days. But they're also recreating the actual courses, which is a step up, especially the downhill and ski jump with mountain views, and the luge and bobsleigh courses too. They're even doing the speed skating and curling. Sounds like they're throwing everything in. Ooh! There are a few screenshots. One shows the four-man bobsleigh, which Zai thinks will be interesting, especially with four-player action. Another shows downhill skiing, and mentions the mountain background is supposed to be Mount Fatawata, though he's being a bit sarcastic saying it's not really a proper Japanese mountain. There's also a luge screenshot, which he jokes is as interesting as watching paint dry, but then says playing the events is great. And finally, a ski jumping shot. Yay. Overall it seems like they're cautiously optimistic about this Nagano Olympics game. It's Konami, so you expect a certain level of quality, but winter sports games could be a bit hit and miss, couldn't they? It's due out in February before the Olympics, so we'll see if it's any good then. This page from Planet N64 Magazine harks back to November 1997, issue 8 if I recall correctly. It's all about Nagano Winter Olympics for the N64. Right in the middle you see a big picture of a ski jumper, proper bright red suit and all, looking very polygonal, bless him. They've got the game logo plastered down the side in big purple letters, ski jump and Nagano Winter Olympics. Very in your face. There are a couple of little screenshots dotted around. One shows someone snowboarding looking a bit blocky compared to today's graphics, naturally, and another of a downhill skier. Seems they're highlighting a few of the events you can have a go at. Down the left it's got a list of event on the horizon, basically the different winter sports in the game. Alpine skiing downhill, alpine skiing giant slalom, individual ski jump, freestyle skiing aerials, snowboarding speed skating, bobsled, luge and curling. They describe each one briefly, like saying downhill is a simple albeit at 75 miles per hour process of passing through gates. A bit understated for hurtling down a mountain face, eh? They even have a little sarcastic dig at luge saying it makes you look like a fool on your tiny toboggan thing. Cheeky. Above the ski jumper chap, there's a little box with reviewer comments. They're talking about snowboarding being split into two types, and to check the event on the horizon list for details. They mention mistakes are frequent in all sports, but in skiing, messing up is a real toot moment. Their words, not mine. ZY, who I think is pronounced Zai, seems to think it all looks nice though. High praise indeed back then. At the bottom it says, to be continued, and no way we'd miss out on reviewing this after Christmas. So this is just a preview then, getting us hyped up for the full review later, probably in the Christmas issue. Release dates are there too, December for Japan and January for the UK, so we had a bit of a wait back then. Published by Konami apparently. Good times, brings back memories of chilly winter evenings battling it out on the N64. This page depicts a spread from N64 Magazine, issue 8. It's got that classic late 90s vibe about it. The main headline screams, Fox gets star treatment, and it's all about Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as the Yanks know it, getting a proper PAL conversion. Looking at the page, there's a Big Earth character holding an N64 controller on the left. Very 90s magazine mascotty. Then you've got the actual article, talking about how PAL conversions used to be a bit rubbish, squash screen, slower gameplay, the works. But apparently Lilac Wars is different. They reckon Konami's UK office had a hand in making sure it wasn't a botched job. There are screenshots of both Lilac Wars and Wave Race 64 box art plastered in the middle of the page, just to remind you what we're talking about. It mentions that for your £60 you even got a Rumble pack bundled with Lilac Wars, which was a big deal at the time. Feeling that Rumble in your hands for the first time was pretty immersive. They even joke about the manual being massive. The article goes on to say that Nintendo in Japan seem to have finally figured out how to do PAL conversions properly, after some Oriental programmers asked them how Rare was doing such a good job with their UK games. It mentions other games that suffered from poor PAL conversions, like Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, which did have that squashed picture and slow down. The reviewer, some chap called ZY, or Zai I suppose it's pronounced, seems quite impressed that Lilac Wars is indistinguishable from the American version, reckons it fills the whole screen, and any slowdown is hardly noticeable. So it sounds like they were finally getting their act together with these PAL conversions. About time really. This page is from an old issue of N64 Magazine, back from November 1997, good times. It's got a few bits and bobs on it, kicking off with an advert for Games Master looking for folks to be on telly if you were a whiz with a joystick apparently. Then there's a piece raving about Nintendo finally getting their act together with PAL conversions, especially with Star Fox 64. or Lilac Wars as it was known here. They're showing off screenshots comparing the squashed-looking older games to how Star Fox 64 looks, saying, "No difference," and all that. Bit dramatic, but you know how magazines were back then. They even mention you could have the text in French in Star Fox, fancy that, just like the SNES version. Warrington Nogre. Next up, it's all about cheaper games. Apparently, the price of making N64 cartridges was coming down, so they reckon we should see games getting a bit cheaper, maybe around 15% off. They mention American gamers getting games $10 cheaper already. They're hoping for games like Duke Nukem 3D, Nagano Winter Olympics, and even Mystical Ninja to get a bit cheaper. There's a section boasting about a new game every week in the run-up to Christmas. They've got a release schedule laid out, listing games like GoldenEye 007, Bomberman 64, Top Gear Rally, Lamborghini 64, Diddy Kong Racing, and Mischief Makers. And they mention even more games coming from other companies, like Duke Nukem 3D again, NFL Quarterback, FIFA Road to World Cup, Madden 64, and Extreme G. Quite a list, eh? Flipping to the other side of the coin, there's a moan about Multi-Racing Championship, saying the UK version has got massive black borders at the top and bottom. They say it's a shame because it's actually a decent game underneath all that wasted screen space. Oh dear. And right at the top there's a stop press. Bit about Diddy Kong Racing. Apparently they had to rewrite the magazine at the last minute because Diddy Kong Racing was finished by Rare. They're saying it looks amazing and has 4-player dinosaur racing in plains and on mountains. And Jonathan, whoever Jonathan is, had to lock himself away to play it. Sounds like they're pretty excited about that one then. This page from the mag is all about new bits and bobs for your N64, and a bit of a shocker about dodgy plugs. Right at the top, there's a warning about import zone. Sounds like folks were having trouble getting their orders, so a bit of a buyer beware heads up there. Then there's the usual 6.4DD update, still just around the corner as ever. Back then it was supposed to be March in Japan and autumn in the US, with Europe being a big question mark, typical. They mention SimCity 64, Pocket Monsters 64, Mario Paint 64, and Mother 3 as launch games. Some real crackers there if they ever actually came out. Over to the right is a bit about Pocket TV. Seems like a Pocket Monsters anime was kicking off in Japan, featuring Pikachu. Bet that was something back in the day. Ruhr. The main chunk of the page is new goods, items to enhance your N64 life. First up is the Action Replay, cheat device of choice. ZY, the reviewer, mentions it's been a bit slow coming out for the N64, and it's a bit pricey at £50. But it's got built-in cheats for loads of games like FIFA 64, MK Trilogy, Pilot Wings 64, Infinite Rocket Fuel for that one. Excellent. Those, Shadows of the Empire, Super Mario 64, Turok, and Wave Race 64. They are even planning smart cards for more cheats later. Cheating is frowned upon, unless it's Mario Kart of course, haha. Next is a 1 meg memory card from Daytel, for £15. Apparently, 1 meg cards weren't the norm at first, and older ones were split into pages of 256K, bit of a faff. This one's one big chunk of 1 meg, much better. Then it's the Tremor Pack, from Interact, basically a Rumble Pack doohickey before the official one was really a thing. ZY reckons it adds something to Lilac Wars, and will work with GoldenEye, Top Gear Rally and Diddy Kong Racing. ETBA price? To be announced. Cheeky. Lastly, there are 2 Trident pads from Spectra Video. A standard one for £20, and a Pro pad for £25. The regular one is alright, but the buttons are a bit clicky, and the joystick area is a bit vague and wobbly. The Pro pad is the same, but with autofire and slow motion buttons, and the £5 more expensive naturally. And then, right at the end, check your plug. Nintendo had found out some Hitachi HE25 plugs on N64s, and SNESs might be dodgy and give you a shock. They tell you to check the plug for Hitachi HE25, and if it says that, call Nintendo for a free replacement. Blimey, health and safety gone mad, even back then. Apparently, about 45,000 N64s and 160,000 SNESs were affected in the UK. Good on Nintendo for flagging it up, mind you. This page of Retro World with Jason Moore in Planet N64 takes a nostalgic look back at some old-school gaming bits and bobs. First up, we've got a bit about Epoch, who apparently were doing handheld consoles way before Nintendo properly got into the swing of things with the Game Boy. They mention the Game Pocket Computer, or GPC, which was their cartridge-based LCD handheld. Sounds a bit like they were trying to get a jump on the market but maybe didn't quite have the magic touch Nintendo did. They mention games for it like Astro Bomber, Reversi, Block Maze and Mahjong, which sounds like a mixed bag, doesn't it? They reckon it was a step up from MB's Microvision, and had a proper directional joypad and fire buttons which must have been quite swanky at the time. Shame it didn't set the world on fire, eh? Next, they're on about Rad Gravity on the NES. Blimey, now that's a blast from the past. They say it was Activision trying to muscle in on Mario's territory with a character called Rad Gravity who's nicking Mario's characters. Sounds a bit cheeky, doesn't it? Apparently it's a platformer in space, typical 8-bit graphics of the time, colourful enough I suppose. The reviewer Zai reckons it's alright, not amazing but decent. Then there's a bit about a Mario alarm clock. You know the kind of thing, aimed squarely at us Nintendo fanatics. Apparently it wakes you up with Mario's voice and theme tune. Bit of a novelty I guess, and they reckon you can still pick them up at car boot sales. Probably more of a dust collector these days. Moving on, they're having a look at Game & Watch, and specifically Fire Attack. Those early Nintendo handhelds were a bit basic but quite addictive in their own way. They say Fire Attack has grotesque themes, which is putting it mildly for a blocky stickman being attacked by red things. You're supposed to defend a wooden fort. Sounds simple, but probably kept you occupied on long car journeys. Key. After that, it's Marble Madness on the NES. Now that's a proper classic, isn't it? Rolling a marble around these isometric levels trying not to fall off the edge. They say it was responsible for a whole genre, which is a bit of a stretch, but it was definitely unique at the time. Fast, smooth gameplay, just like the arcade version apparently. They've given it a good score, 81%, so it must still hold up. Lastly there's the N64 board, which looks like a reader's page. Someone's painted their N64 pale turquoise for some reason. People do strange things, don't they? There are also reader pictures. One of Wave Race, one of Bomberman, and a funny one of Yoshi and Mario. Nick Cowan and Kevin Eady get a mention for sending bits in. Looks like a bit of community spirit, which is always nice. And that's about the long and short of this page. A bit of a retro gaming roundup, touching on some older consoles and games, and reader submissions. Good for a bit of nostalgia, I suppose. This page is all about the state of platform games on the N64, or rather the slight delay in getting them. Nintendo were having to apologize apparently for them being late, blaming it on signaling problems in the Kyoto area, which sounds a bit vague if you ask me. Probably some sort of management speak for "we messed up." The main feature is about a game called Tonic Trouble from Ubisoft. This Ed character is their new platforming hero, and they're saying it's visually inspired by Rayman, which was Ubisoft's other big platformer at the time. Apparently Ed is a bit of an oddball, no arms but his hands float around him. Sounds a bit bonkers, very French. The reviewer Zai went to have a look at it at the ECTS show in London. From the sounds of it, they're still quite early on in development. They mention a snow level that was a bit of a laugh, but the reviewer is already worrying about whether there's actually any proper gameplay there yet, beyond just looking nice. They're saying it's due out in France in December, but typical for us in the UK is just TBA to be announced. Always the way, isn't it? Misha. And just to keep things grounded, there's a little caption under the screenshot saying Mr. Render has waved his hires stick over this publicity screenshot. Basically a reminder not to get too carried away with the fancy pictures. The actual game in motion might not look quite as slick. Wise words from Zai, keeping it real as always. This page depicts a preview from an old N64 magazine, seems like issue 8, and it's all about games coming in 3D, which was a big deal back then, wasn't it? First up is Scale Model for Gex, Enter the Gecko. Remember Gex? They're saying forget the old 2D ones from PlayStation and Saturn. Bit harsh, were they really that bad? Anyway, this Gex is meant to be a proper leap forward, all in 3D. ZY, the reviewer, saw a 70% complete version and was apparently well impressed. No more of that 2D jumping and sprites. It's polygon characters in a full 3D world. They even mention the voice acting, British voice for the UK release, which is a bit of alright. Sounds like Gex gets stuck in a movie-themed nightmare world. Typical. Apparently it's better than just running through levels, which is good to hear. And it's coming in December, cross-platform for PC, PlayStation and N64. They do say it might not be as graphically stunning as some N64 exclusives, but plays like a souped UP Tomb Raider, which is high praise at the time I suppose. They reckon it'll be out in spring as well, which is a bit vague, isn't it? Regi. Then there's a section called Eager 3D Waiting, looking at other upcoming games. Banjo-Kazooie is there, Nintendo's big Christmas hope, though they say it's turned into an early next year hope. Typical Nintendo delays. UK release in January, Japan later, probably February. They mention the dual character gameplay and say it looks good from E3 and screenshots. Kiev. Next is Conker's Quest, also from Rare and Nintendo. March release in Japan, no UK date yet. They quote Conker saying, "Hi, I'm Conker." Ooh, sounds like they're going for humor, which is, interesting for a squirrel. They think it looks like platform heaven, but the Conquer character might be a bit much for some. Turns stomachs, they say. Bit dramatic. Then there's Space Circus from Ocean/Infograms. It's French and it's weird, is apparently the line from Ocean. Doesn't sound too promising, does it? They say it won't be out until well into next year. They played it at E3 and say it's a favorite. Our French agents are scouting hard as you read. Dramatic again. Space Jelly from Software Creations is next. Very mysterious release date. They have incredible 6 games in development, but are keeping quiet about this one. Space Jelly have met with polite but stonewall resistance. Sounds like they couldn't get much info. Chameleon Twist from Ocean/Infograms. No release date. They're being mysterious about this one too, saying it's a 3D platformer. Has it got a chameleon in it? No comment. Very helpful. Apparently, it does star a chameleon, going through various levels from forests to industrial wastelands. Lastly, Earthworm Jim 3D from Interplay, worldwide release early '98. They say full details are on page 10 with pictures. Curious game, they call it. Overall, seems like everyone's jumping on the 3D bandwagon, some looking more promising than others. Lots of TBAs, and vague release dates, par for the course back then. Always a bit of a waiting game, wasn't it? This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at a new fighting game called GASP. Remember those days when every new 3D fighter was pitched as a Tekken killer? This one's no different, although they are hoping it's good. Apparently it was called Battle Dancers before, and it's a 3D fighting game. Naturally, they say a bit like Tekken, but with about 700 moves, which sounds like a lot, doesn't it? They mention it's more hand-to-hand combat focused than sword-based games like Soul Blade. None of that colourful sword-swishing malarkey here. The reviewer, ZY, reckons fighting game fans could do with a decent beat-em-up, and they say you can even create your own fighter, which was a cool idea back then. Made you feel a bit more invested, didn't it? Looking at the screenshots, you can see they're going for interactive backgrounds. You know, chucking drain pipes and boxes at each other, that kind of thing, which was always a laugh. Eeke. There are a few little comments dotted around the screenshots too. One's got a bit of a cheesy line about hands being lethal weapons. Trained, you know, Miss Jones. Sounds like something a Bond villain would say, doesn't it? Someone's spotted what looks like a Volkswagen camper van in the background of one of the levels. Bit random. And they're having a laugh about the windows being too small. Another comment says the backgrounds are nice, like how backgrounds used to be. Which is a bit of a backhanded compliment if you ask me. Maybe current games were getting too fancy for their own good. And finally there's a note about an impact mark being a bit blocky. Typical N64 graphics really. Wasn't everything a bit blocky back then? Yeah. The game's from Konami, and it was coming out in Japan in March '98, with a UK release slated for summer '98, so still a bit of a wait at that point. Looks like they thought it had potential, but they weren't getting overly hyped just yet. Sensible approach really. This page features a couple of previews for upcoming games on the N64. First up we have NBA In the Zone 98 from Konami. Apparently it's a bit strange that it's being previewed for Christmas when hardly any shots have been seen of it. The reviewer, ZY, reckons it might not even make it for Christmas, and what they did see at ECTS was a bit sparse. Konami is promising a more realistic basketball game than Midway's efforts, with loads of moves, player likenesses, and full season stats, Rumble Pack support, and up to 4 players. They're a bit miffed the creator-player feature might not be in this version though. There's a screenshot showing some blocky-looking polygonal players on court. It does look a bit early days, to be honest. Borington North. Below that, there's a preview for Hybrid Heaven, also from Konami. This one sounds a bit more interesting. It's pitched as a sister project to Metal Gear Solid. It's about some Earth invasion story, where a government is creating ultimate soldiers on a space station and sending them to Earth. Apparently, one soldier goes a bit rogue, and the authorities are trying to take him down, but it turns out there are 6 of them. All these ultimate soldiers. It sounds a bit bonkers. The gameplay is supposed to be third-person action combat, a bit like Turok, but with an RPG element, where enemies mutate. There's a screenshot of a rather shadowy-looking character, and another one showing some kind of alien creature. They reckon we'll be hearing more about this one soon. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 8 it seems, is having a look at Wetrix. Right there at the top of the page, Water Wonderland, it boldly proclaims. It's one of those games where you're building up landscapes with falling blocks and trying to trap water in lakes. Bit of a peculiar idea, but alright, we'll see. Orchestra. According to the text, if you let too much water escape, some beaker thingy overflows and it's game over. Sounds a bit stressful. They mention landscape dissolvers, bombs, meteors and earthquakes too, so it's not just about neatly placing blocks. There's a competitive mode mentioned, which at the moment is just split screen 2-player, but they reckon it'll be 4-player eventually. Imagine the arguments over that. The reviewer, some ZY bloke Zai I guess it is pronounced, thinks the basic idea is alright but says it needs a bit of polish. He's saying it looks complicated, trying to figure out where your blocks are gonna land. He mentions the isometric view and the grid system make it tricky to place things properly. Says it makes it unnecessarily difficult, even though it's already a challenging game. But he does reckon if they get it right, Ocean could have a decent puzzler on their hands. We'll have to wait and see on that one, I suppose. There are a few screenshots here too. You can see the sort of 3D blocky landscapes they are talking about, with water in them, and little blobs that must be the water droplets. Looks a bit basic, but it's early days for the N64, isn't it? One of the screenshots shows a menu with Practice Mode, Wetrix Classic, Wetrix Pro, and 1UP versus 2UP. So, looks like there's a few ways to play it then. They've also got little captions in triangles dotted about explaining bits of the game like water monitors and tilting the angle, all that sort of thing. Looks like they are trying to make it sound a bit more involved than just stacking blocks. Planet 64 coming soon logo at the top as well, must be previews of other stuff in the mag. Overall, Wetrix could be a bit of alright puzzle fun if they sort out the fiddly bits. This page is a preview from Planet 64, issue 25, November 1997, and it's all about the upcoming Legend of Zelda 64. Right at the top, it's got this cool manga-style artwork of Link and some fairy character, with the RPG News logo, looking very colourful. Kidida. The main headline screams, Miyamoto talks Zelda, which is always exciting. It's saying, Legend of Zelda 64 inches in big letters, and underneath it's got the Nintendo 256mm cart size, controller icon, and a single player. Release date is down as December for Japan, and TBA for us Brits, which is typical, isn't it? Borintesha. The article itself is by ZY, pronounced Zai, and it's about Shigeru Miyamoto, revealing more about Zelda 64 just a month and a half before the Shoshinkai show. They're saying it's Nintendo's most anticipated title, which, let's be honest, it probably was back then. Miyamoto's been chatting about Link and his ever-expanding inventory. Apparently there's a boomerang in the game, and only Kid Link can use it initially, but adult Link might get to use it too. They say there are two ways to use it: to beat enemies and to pick things up, which sounds pretty standard Zelda fare. Bow and arrows will have two uses as well. There's talk about this kid and adult Link business, which is still a bit vague. It's set after the SNES Zelda games, but Link looks older. Rumors suggest he literally grows up during the game, which is intriguing. The reviewer points out that it sounds almost too good to be true. First-person view when you throw the boomerang, just like firing an arrow, which sounds interesting if a bit gimmicky. Miyamoto says you can change the viewpoint yourself, and it also changes automatically with certain items. Then there's the downer. Nintendo publicist Yoshio Hongo basically says they don't know if it'll be out this year or not. Even though they try to meet release dates, development can be unpredictable. So basically, classic Nintendo, it might be out when it's ready, or maybe next year. They're suggesting we should look out for more details at Nintendo World 97. The page has got some screenshots dotted around. One says, "Pop up anyone? We don't think so," over a couple of small screen grabs, implying they are not using pop-up in the graphics, which would be expected for the N64 really. There's another one saying, "All this business about Link growing up is starting to become clear. But whether it's done during the game or as a flashback, we don't know." The screenshots themselves are quite small and dark, showing Link in typical Zelda locations, one of him fighting a big green thing, and another of him on horseback. Standard Zelda stuff really, but in 3D. The article ends by telling us to have a good ogle at the screenshots while we wait for more news. And that's about it really, just classic Zelda hype from back in the day. This page showcases a couple of games coming to the N64, and some tidbits of news, typical of the time really. First up is Cup Run, or Fighting Cup as it's actually called. Seems like Imagineer, who did that multi-racing championship, are having a go at a beat-em-up. They previewed it yonks ago, in issue 4 as Struggle Hard, but seems like they've changed the name, and Ocean are publishing it over here. It's trying to do something a bit different by mixing fighting with races to deplete your opponent's energy. They're giving points for ring-outs, knockouts, and fancy moves. Sounds a bit like they're trying to reinvent the wheel, but ZY, the reviewer, seems cautiously optimistic that it might be better than Dark Rift and War Gods, which, let's be honest, isn't saying much. There's a screenshot showing a couple of chunky-looking polygonal fighters named Crown and Saeki, battling it out in front of a castle. Another smaller screenshot shows a replay, and a character named Valerie, who looks a bit like a blonde Lara Croft type. Then there's a little news section called An Ear to the Ground. Apparently, Nintendo has a new game with a yellow dog thing called Pikachu Genki Dekshu. Sounds a bit odd, but apparently it's a standalone Pocket Monster game. Interesting if you are into that sort of thing, I suppose. Imagineer are also doing a SimCity 2000 for the N64, which they say doesn't look that different from the SNES one. They're still tweaking it, apparently. And get this, sticking with Imagineer and Fighting Cup again, it seems people are moaning about the visuals, and Ocean want them to tart it up a bit. Namco are doing a baseball game called Famista 64, with motion-captured humans instead of cutesy characters, and some alien race called the Metalians who are good at baseball. Right then. Lastly, Konami's NBA in the Zone, 98 feet, is coming to the N64, but it won't be called Power Dunkers over here, they're sticking with the American name. Finally, there's Virtual Chess 64 feet from Titus. Apparently it's got a powerful game engine and is versatile, catering to all levels of player. They're even saying you can have 4 players at once, which for chess seems a bit mad, doesn't it? There's a cartoon battle mode, and nobody seems to know what that's all about. Will from the mag is going to review it when it arrives, and they reckon it might even replace Mahjong as his quiet time game. There are some tiny screenshots of chessboards, showing different views and game setups. Nothing too exciting. It's chess after all. This page is from the mag and it's talking about how well the Game Boy is doing for Nintendo. Apparently they've made a massive profit, something like 48 billion yen, which is loads, isn't it? And it's all thanks to the Game Boy. They reckon production has gone up to 100,000 units a month since August. The article says it's all down to the popularity of Pocket Monsters in Japan. It mentions they've sold over 6 million copies by August, which is apparently even more than Super Mario managed. Blimey, that's a lot of Pocket Monsters. Apparently a clever trick they did was release 3 versions of the game with different colored boxes, red, green and blue, even though the game is basically the same. Marketing, eh? There's a picture of the Pocket Monster box art, you can see those weird creatures on there, and a shot of the Game Boy screen itself, with what looks like one of those monster games. It also mentions that Super Mario Bros., from back in '85 on the Famicom, had sold over 6 million copies too by that point. And Pocket Monsters has already sold over 6 million in just a year and a half since February '96. Nintendo 64 sales in Japan are a bit static apparently, unlike in America where they've shifted loads. And even in the UK and France it's doing better than in Japan. Then there's a bit about the Japanese music scene, calling it the Tokyo culture scene. It's talking about these really young pop stars, like this group called Speed and another one called Folder, where the lead singer is only 10 years old. It says some people in Japan don't have a problem with it, seeing it as business and talent, but there are obviously issues with young kids in that kind of industry. Bit weird really, isn't it? This page from the magazine is giving us a bit of a roundup of what's going on in the world of Nintendo. First off, it talks about Nintendo's profits doing well, though maybe not for the reasons you'd think. Apparently the Game Boy is still doing bits and bobs for them over in Japan, and they're pinning their hopes on Zelda 64 to give the old N64 a kick up the backside closer to Christmas. Sounds like they've got this 64DD and network plan thing coming in March, which they reckon will be their big push. Always something on the horizon with Nintendo, isn't there? Warrant. Then there's a piece on a football game called 11 Beat. It's based on the Japanese J-League, and apparently it's doing something a bit different with camera angles. Sounds like it keeps the focus on the player with the ball, but spins it around so you're always running upwards. A bit odd, but they say it's easy to control with just the joystick and a couple of buttons. You can even make your own teams and mess about with their kits and even skin color, which is a bit more than you got in your average footy game back then. Next, there's the usual Pokemon rumor mill churning away. Apparently there's a secret monster called Mew in Pocket Monster on the Game Boy. Apparently it's only accessible by exploiting some bug in the game. Bit cheeky that. But it sounds like it can mess with your saved game, and Nintendo are getting flooded with calls from angry punters who've lost all their progress. They reckon Mew's meant to be a prize from special tournaments, so maybe they didn't want everyone getting it easily. After that, they're talking about a game called Medoro, which they reckon might be the next big thing after Pokemon. It's about building robots out of different parts, and then battling them. Sounds like you can even swap parts with your mates. It's tied in with some comic called Comic Bonbon, so it's clearly aimed at the younger crowd. Key. Then there's a bit asking what's happening with Tactics Ogre on the N64. Apparently, Quest, who made it, were working on an N64 version of this RPG that was popular on the SNES and PlayStation. But the bloke in charge of the story has buggered off to Square to work on Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation. So they're wondering who's gonna actually make the N64 version now. Tactics Ogre was alright back in the day, a bit complex for some maybe, but they thought it was nearly perfect, apparently. Bit strong that. Lastly, there's a bit about this band called Folder. Never heard of them myself, but apparently they're a group of youngsters who are getting big in Japan. They've got a song called Parachute. It mentions Hanson being top of the charts in America and suggests pop stars aimed at kids are all the rage. Then there's a random line about Japanese kids asking if you're into Speed. No idea what that's about, some other band maybe? Kids and their pop music, eh? Oh, and dotted about the page are pictures of Pokemon cards, screenshots from that football game, and some photos of this folder band. Standard magazine fare, really. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 8 I reckon, takes us back to November 97. Right at the top it's got An Englishman in Tokyo by Max Everingham, who looks a bit like he's had enough of queuing. Turns out he's been doing just that, at both the Tokyo Game Show and Tokyo Disneyland. Right? He moans a bit about the queues at the Tokyo Game Show, especially after playing GoldenEye 007, which he calls sublime. Bit strong that. He mentions the Shoshinkai event coming up in November as Nintendo's own show, and that Yoshi's Island will be there, although the release date's still November apparently. Then there's a bit called They're All Great, where he's talking about Nintendo 64 games. Says he's decided to stop calling every new N64 game the best game ever, after getting carried away with Super Mario 64, Blast Corps, International Superstar Soccer 64, and now GoldenEye. He reckons N64 games are just top-notch, full stop. There are a couple of small screenshots from GoldenEye showing an explosion and the watch gadget. Looks like he's properly into it. Warranty. There's also a summer holiday bit about Japanese workers all going on holiday at the same time, and how bonkers Tokyo Disneyland queues are. He's not impressed with the snake queuing system where you think you're near the front, then you round a corner and it goes on forever, like some warehouse. In a yellow box there's a Learn Japanese section, bit of a regular feature in these mags. It's got phrases like donogurai, meaning how long, sugoi, for great, cool, ichiban, meaning number one, and omoshiroi kunai, which is not interesting. Handy for your next trip to Akihabara maybe. Finally, there's a section titled The Appliance of Science, with a blurry picture of a game show stand for Spike's VR Rally. The caption says something about a raised platform giving an opportunity for iffy Jeremy Beadle antics. Cheeky. It's comparing the crowds at game shows to real life, saying you get all sorts there, and then mentions if you stand under the gangway at the Spike's VR Rally stand you might get a home video opportunity. Sounds a bit dodgy if you ask me, but typical lads mag humour back then. This page is a right blast from the past, isn't it? It's a proper advert for the Nintendo 64 and Lilac Wars, which I suppose you lot probably know as Star Fox 64 over in the States. It's got all the usual suspects, Fox McCloud right up front, and then Slippy Toad, Peppy Hare, and Falco Lombardi, all ready for a bit of space shooting. They've got these chunky, slightly polygonal character models, very much of the time for the N64, and the R-Wing ships look decent enough, even if they are a bit blocky now compared to modern stuff. The tagline is, "Feel the adventure with Nintendo." Bit cheesy, but that's marketing for you. It bangs on about it being a Nintendo 64 game, and mentions it's got Fox McCloud, Slippy, Peppy, and Falco in Lilac Wars, obviously in case you weren't entirely sure who was in it. It also says it's got 4-player mode, which was always good for a laugh with your mates, and over 600 soundbites of real dialogue, which, let's be honest, was probably mostly just Peppy shouting, "Do a barrel roll." Still, at the time it was pretty impressive. Quaranting. Down at the bottom it's got the usual marketing spiel about the N64 itself. 64-bit power, 94 MHz speed, 3D environment, rumble pack included, stereo sound, precision control, and multiplayer. They're really pushing the rumble packing, which was a bit of a gimmick but did add something to the experience, I suppose. And they're calling the N64 the fastest, most powerful games console on Earth, which, well, back then it probably felt that way to us, even if now it looks a bit dated. But yeah, Lilac Wars, that was a good one. Proper space dogfights, on the telly. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine Arena is all about Lilac Wars, which is what they're calling Star Fox 64 in this issue, probably to sound a bit more epic. Different name, but thankfully still the same rip-roaring game, it says, which is fair enough. There's a big picture of Fox McCloud's polygonal face staring out at you, and a screenshot of the game itself. Looks like a boss battle going on. It says go to page 34, so the actual review must be later in the mag. Below that, it's got the guide to scoring, explaining how they give out marks. They're quite serious about it, saying cartridges are expensive, so they play games properly before giving them a Star Game medal, which is fair enough given the price of N64 games back then. Yellow is 85% and above, proper top tier stuff. Blue is 84% to 70%, which is still good, jolly good fun. Green is 69% to 50%. Perfectly playable, but nothing special. Then red is 49% to 20%, which is getting into lazily programmed territory. And grey is 19% to 0%, which is basically bin fodder. They say they haven't seen anything that bad yet on the N64, but they're ready to punish it ruthlessly if they do. Bit dramatic, eh? This page is all about upcoming games for the N64 back in the day. It's got a big feature on Multi-Racing Championship versus Top Gear Rally, pitching them as a massive rally game showdown on the N64, telling you to go to page 48 for more. Kitty. Then there's the Import Arena section, always a bit exciting to see what's coming over from Japan and America. They're highlighting Baku Bomberman, which looked like a right laugh, and some Japanese football games, J-League Dynamite Soccer and JICU World Soccer 3. They're saying the Japanese try footy again, and again. Genna? Bit cheeky. And then, Mischief Makers, described as American translation of Troublemakers, with the tagline, "Out here for Xmas." Below that, they've got a How It Works bit, explaining their review scoring with categories like Visuals, Sounds, Mastery and Lifespan, all marked out of 9 for some reason. Then there's the Verdict, which is supposed to be a scientific measure of how much fun a game is. Yeah, right. Lastly, there's Team 64, introducing their reviewers Jonathan Davies, Will Overton, James Ashton, Tim Weaver, Paul Jarrell, Jess Bickham, Jonathan Nash, and Z.Y. Nicholson, or Zai as I think it's pronounced. Each of them has a little quote, and their Game of the Month pick. Jonathan Davies is on Top Gear Rally, Will Overton is on Mischief Makers, James Ashton is reviewing GoldenEye 007, Tim Weaver is on World Soccer 3, Paul Jarrell also on GoldenEye 007, Jess Bickham is on Blastcore, Jonathan Nash is on Lilac Wars, and Zai Nicholson is reviewing Gomon and Baku Bomberman it seems, and apparently did his Baku Bomberman review super fast, a record breaker apparently. They're making them all sound like heroes. Bit much really, but it's all a bit of fun, isn't it? This page from N64 Magazine, issue 8 it must be, features a bold splash for Lilat, which we all knew as Star Fox 64 back then, or Lilac Wars if you were being proper about it. It's got the Star Fox team plastered across the page. Fox, Falco, Peppy and Slippy are all there in their polygonal glory, along with their R-Wing ships. They're looking quite heroic, floating amongst some space rocks and planets. Bit dramatic if you ask me. Down at the bottom it mentions their review of Star Fox, or Lilac Wars as they called it back in issue 3. Apparently it got a stonking 94%, which wasn't bad going. I remember that. Everyone was raving about Star Fox 64 at the time, proper 3D shooter with full voice acting. It was quite something for the N64 in '97. There's also a tiny little screenshot from the game in the corner, you can barely make it out, but it's definitely Star Fox in action. Takes you back to when polygons were king, doesn't it? This page depicts an advert for Lilac Wars on the N64, which us Brits might remember was actually Star Fox 64 everywhere else. A bit of a weird name change if you ask me, and they even have a little sarcastic quip about it on the page. It starts off with a bit of a fancy invitation to join Fox McCloud and his mates Peppy Hare, Falco Lombardi and Slippy Toad on their adventures. They're promising all sorts of chaos, from train wrecks to dodgy environmental meetings, mutated monsters, massive robots, and plenty of explosions. Bit over the top but gets the point across, doesn't it? Warrant? Then it announces Fox landing in the UK, with a big Wars in yellow, making a point about the game title I suppose. There's a box with the usual info saying it's out now in the UK, costs £60 blimey, games were pricey back then, needs 96 megs, supports 1 to 4 players, and uses the controller pack for saves. Standard N64 stuff really. Gay. You've got a few little screenshots showing off the game, space battles and whatnot, and a go button at the bottom like they're really trying to get you hyped. It's from N64 Magazine, page 35, from November 1997. Takes you back, doesn't it? Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 8, it's got a bit of a Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as it's called here, special going on. It's all about the English translation of the game, and whether it's any good, which was always a concern back then, wasn't it? There are a couple of bits here under the main title Star Fox but in English. First up is Jonathan Nash giving his thoughts. He sounds a bit miffed about the US translation, reckons it's not up to scratch after the Japanese version. He's going on about cheesy lines like, destroy the bioweapon, and reckons the plot is a bit thin. He's even having a dig at the voice acting, saying it's all a bit too enthusiastic and not very convincing compared to the Japanese voices, saying they sound flat and hopeless. He mentions Star Fox in a sarcastic way, so you get the idea. He prefers the Japanese voiceover, and reckons the American translation minimizes the thrill. Bit harsh maybe? Then there's another opinion from a representative of everyone else ever in the whole world. Bit of a mouthful that. This chap seems a bit more forgiving. He's saying the translation does its job and makes the game accessible. He even says the US actors do a good job impersonating the Japanese ones, and that everyone sounds right for the part. He mentions the dialogue is alright for telling you what you need to know, like where the warps are and how to beat the boss. He even likes the villain lines, especially Andros, and reckons Fox is like the bloke next door, which is a fox apparently. He does say you can turn the voices off if you want, so he's covering his bases. He judges the translation to be unintrusive and illuminating, which is a fancy way of saying it's not bad, I suppose. Down the side, there's a box about character voices, listing Mike West, Rick May, Lissa Brown, and Jock Blaney. Presumably these are the voice actors for the game. There's also a bit called The Journal of Fox McCloud, with an editor's note saying the adventures are different each time you play, which was quite a thing back then with games starting to get a bit more clever with how they played out. Then at the bottom there's Corneria, with some screenshots of the game in action. You can see Falco having a chat saying that's what he thinks, but he's wrong. He will in fact. Typical Falco, always a bit of a know-it-all. There's another one with Peppy saying do a barrel roll, which everyone remembers, don't they? And another one with Andros saying I will not be defeated by this whir. Classic stuff. Even if Jonathan Nash isn't too impressed with the lines. Overall, it's a bit of a debate about whether the English voice acting in Star Fox 64 is any good. One reviewer is quite critical, preferring the original Japanese, while the other is more accepting, saying it does the job. It's the kind of thing we were all wondering about at the time when these games were coming over from Japan, always a gamble whether the translations would be alright. This page from the N64 magazine is having a look at Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as we knew it here. In the N64 arena section must be tips and tricks then. First up is Meteo. Day 2 it says. Sounds like a right old mess, doesn't it? Falco's being a pain as usual, shooting open rocks and generally acting daft. Peppy's chiming in telling you to use bombs wisely. Cheers Peppy, very helpful. Apparently these chaps are a bit foolish and you can get them from behind, crafty-like. They've even built a big battle cruiser, but daft as brushes they've painted their weak spots yellow, like they are asking for it. Then it moves on to Titania, Day 3. Poor old Slippy's crashed his kite, the silly sausage. Apparently you have to use the Landmaster tank on this level, not the R-Wing, which is a bit of a change. Something about laser beams being thin and rockets underneath. Sounds like a right rumble on the ground then. You need to raise your turret to splash airborne opponents apparently, who knew? And then there's a bit about pickups. They're showing off the gold ring, collect 3 of these for a longer power bar, and more score obviously. Silver rings refill your power bar a bit if you've taken a beating. Stars are like 3 silver rings in one go, loads of power then. Bombs are for when you want to make a big bang, save them for bosses they reckon. Power-up crates from NUS064, whoever he is, drop power-ups when you shoot them. Laser upgrade, to make your lasers even stronger. And wing repair, for when you've been shot to bits, and your R-Wing is falling apart. All the usual bits and bobs to help you out really. ZY, or Zai as he wants to be called, seems to be having a bit of a laugh with it all. Typical games mag humor. Yep, brings back memories of thumbing through these pages back in the day. This page from N64 Magazine feels like a blast from the past, doesn't it? It's all about Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as we knew it over here back in the day. This must be around November 97, going by the feel of it. The page is an arena feature focusing on 2 planets, Solar and Katina. It's giving us the lowdown on what to expect. For Solar, they're talking about Peppy being withdrawn, and Falco having a bit of a mishap. Looks like there's lava to contend with, and a tip about spinning the ship by pressing Z and R to reduce lava damage. Always handy that. They mention silver stars for sustenance, classic Star Fox power-ups. And then there's Falco being his usual grumpy self, calling Andros an insane fool. Moving on to Katina, it seems to be a bit of a frantic stage. They mention Dickens of a Day, and Johnny who turns out to be Bill, confusingly. Poor Bill is getting shelled about a bit. It's described as a splendid battle, with loads of enemies to shoot down. They even advise to shoot Bill's team unreservedly, which sounds a bit harsh on your supposed allies, even if they are a bit useless sometimes. Apparently Katina is just sky full of ships, goodies and baddies with inevitable casualties. Sounds like typical Star Fox chaos really. There are little boxes about Cat and Bill the characters too. Cat, or Cat as she's properly spelled apparently, is some old flame of Falco's and Bill is originally Bill, but they changed it to avoid confusion with some pulp character. Fair enough, can't have that can we? Borcaroli. Overall, it's your standard magazine preview getting you hyped for the levels, dropping some hints and tips. Remember reading these whilst waiting for Pocket Money Day to actually get the game. Good times. This page delves into the N64 arena section of an old N64 magazine, focusing on Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64, as some of us might remember it across the pond. There's a bit of a diary entry vibe going on for each level they're highlighting, starting with zones. Apparently, it's day 7, and Falco's had a bit of a rough time, losing all his feathers and looking like he's gone bald. Charming, They reckon it's set underwater, and you're facing some kind of giant hair pirate. The screenshot shows this sea monster, which they describe as scary fellow, though I'm not sure about all that. They point out to keep an eye out for crates with power-ups, and make a slightly odd comparison to James Bond films with exploding barrels. The tip for zones itself is to skim low over the sea during a storm. Peppy, bless him, pipes up with a warning about traps, as usual. Moving on to Macbeth, which is day 8. This time it's all about a train level. They mention Falco doing something daft with a poncho, and suggest he looks like a fool. Always good to see Falco getting a bit of stick. The gameplay tips are fairly standard. Shoot the train constantly as you follow it, fire at the rear to make the kite vulnerable, and shoot signals to change the points, presumably to divert the train. Sounds like a bit of a puzzle element there. There's some panic dialogue from Peppy shouting about brakes and someone else saying they can't stop it, which adds a bit of drama. They also big up the rumble pack, saying you can feel your rumble pack tremble comfortably if you get it right. The rumble pack, that was a game changer back then, wasn't it? Though comfortably trembling might be pushing it a bit. There's a side bit called They've Gone Plaid about warp zones in Lilac Wars. Apparently there are 2 hidden in one game, which they found irritating to work out. They mention shooting giant noses to warp, which sounds about right for Star Fox 64's strangeness. They also mention geometric shapes and wobbly graphic effects, and make a slightly pretentious comparison to Doom programmers and objects spelling out 64. Alright ZY, calm down, it's still blocky N64 graphics at the end of the day. Yeah. Finally, there's a little section called THRRRRBBB, just banging on about the Rumble Pack again. They're calling Star Fox 64 the best Rumble Pack game, and describing how you can crash your plane dramatically, and how the Rumble Pack makes it all more pleasant. Bit weird, but each to their own. They mention you get one with the car for £60, and then add, shoe, for kids. 60 quid was a lot of pocket money back then, even for us older kids. Still, Star Fox 64 with the Rumble Pack was a decent experience for its time, I suppose. This page from N64 Magazine, it looks like they're having a look at Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as we knew it here back in '97. It starts off in the N64 arena bit, by the looks of it, with the reviewer ZY saying Star Fox on the SNES wasn't his cup of tea, all confusing graphics and that, but then he went on to play Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Superfoul Egg, so not all bad then, eh? The next bit's about Aguas, one of the levels, and it seems like old Slippy's getting in a flap about something. They mention a boss clam that spits pearls at you, which sounds a bit odd, but easily sorted apparently. It's an underwater level, so naturally it's all a bit dark and eerie. Then there's Sector Z, which they call Sector Z. Sounds a bit more exciting. Lots of fast action going on. Peppy and Falco are there. Sounds like Falco had a bit of a mishap, but he's alright. Apparently there's this butterfly enemy, a mighty foe they reckon, firing spiraling fireballs. Sounds a bit intense for a butterfly, to be honest. Lastly, they touch on battle mode, saying it's simple but alright for a laugh with your mates, especially tank battles. They're saying it's best if you've got a few mates around, which is a bit of a cheeky way of saying it's multiplayer only, isn't it? All in all, sounds like they're quite enjoying Star Fox 64, even if they're not going totally overboard about it. This page from the N64 magazine, right, it's all about Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as you might know it over in the colonies. We're looking at Area 6 feet and Venom. Seems like we're getting towards the pointy end of the game then. Day 11, Area 6. They're calling it the Big Push. Sounds dramatic. Apparently it's all about blasting through chaps and NGs and all that, a good old aerial bombardment. The screenshots show the action. Typical Star Fox stuff. Lasers flying, explosions, you know the drill. They're banging on about the second line and Venom in the background. Clever stuff apparently. And there's mention of thus far unseen special effects, bit much isn't it? It's just a game after all, albeit a good looking one for the N64 at the time. Then day 12 is Venom, the final step. Mr. A, whoever he is, clearly thought we'd get lost in the maze bits, but they didn't slow them down much. They mention SBCSs being ridiculously easy pickings. Sounds like they breezed through it. The screenshots here show more tunnel flying and dodgy looking beasties. There's a bit about facing a terrifyingly enhanced Starwolf team if you arrived at Venom along this route. And then the big cheese himself, Andros, they're comparing him to the Emperor from Return of the Jedi, bit of a stretch maybe? Fox is there saying his usual heroic lines. Mamas. Off to the side there's a bit called They Hate You. Bit melodramatic, isn't it? Seems like ZY the reviewer is having a laugh at Nintendo's expense, saying even after all the delays and the price of the N64, we'll still buy Star Fox. He's even joking about delaying Yoshi's Island and calling it hands up I have a gun, put the money in the bag, bit cheeky. Says even his hardened heart quivers at the thought of us all buying it anyway. Bit cynical, but probably not far off the mark, to be honest. We were all suckers for Nintendo back then, weren't we? Good times, good times. This page from N64 Magazine, harking back to issue 8, does a bit of a deep dive into Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as we knew it here. It kicks off talking about medals, those shiny rewards, for being a bit of a completionist, and getting all the wing blokes in a level with a top score. ZY, the reviewer, seems a bit underwhelmed by the whole medal concept, finding it a bit tedious, preferring to just get on with blasting Andross's minions. There's a little suggestion box too, pondering what could have been with Falco, Peppy and Slippy, suggesting they could have been more involved in the gameplay beyond just needing rescuing. The main chunk of the page is about the sinister black-clad anti-Star Fox, which is a cool name for the bad guy versions of the Star Fox team. It mentions Starwolf, Leon, Pigma and Andrew, who's described as Andross's crap nephew. Charming. They're the shadowy counterparts to Fox, Falco, Peppy and Slippy, and apparently, your wingmen can hold their own against them for once, which is a nice change. ZY mentions the villain dialogue being decent, which is always a plus. Then it breaks down the different modes of transport in Star Fox 64. Fly Fox, Race Fox, and Swim Fox. Fly Fox is all about the R-wing controls, going through the analog stick and button layout. It talks about moves like the Immelman turn, which we all tried to master back in the day. Race Fox covers the Landmaster tank and again control tips for that, including a rocket-boosted backflip. Sounds like a laugh if you could pull it off. Finally, Swim Fox deals with the Blue Marine sub for the Aquas level. Apparently you get infinite missiles, but you've got to wait for each one to detonate before firing another, which sounds a bit like tactical patience is needed down there in the murky depths. There are a few screenshots dotted around, showing off the R-Wing and Landmaster in action, reminding you just how chunky but charming those N64 graphics were at the time. All in all, a decent page giving some handy tips for Star Fox 64, and a bit of flavor text for those of us who were eagerly awaiting the game back in '97. This page depicts a review of Lilac Wars, which you and I would know better as Star Fox 64. Right then, so it's from N64 Arena, in November 1997, blimey that was a while ago wasn't it? Wars. The reviewer, Jonathan Nash, seems pretty chuffed with it, calling Nintendo's handling of the UK conversion exemplary after the Wave Race 64 PAL debacle, which I remember being a bit of a sore point back in the day. He's happy they got rid of those awful black borders from Mario Kart 64, and that the slowdown is minimal. Proper job. He bangs on a bit about the translation, calling it a nasty thing, but admits the gameplay is still top-notch, comparing it to R-Type but in 3D, and with free-flying dogfights, sounds about right. He mentions you can only see about 7 of the 18 levels in one go, unless you find warps, which adds to replayability. Apparently you can finish a game in about 70 minutes, which is quite a bit shorter than some games back then. There are screenshots dotted around the page of gameplay, including one with the text, "Stick to the pond, Froggy," classic Andrew and his banter. In it, another shows a boss fight, looked pretty impressive at the time. The review highlights the splendid Macbeth tactics, which I guess means taking out the big baddies efficiently. Down the side, there are little boxes rating different aspects, all getting a solid 9 out of 10. Visuals are diverse, spectacular, incredibly detailed, wholly convincing. Sounds are just smashing effects and a score rather than music, and hours of speech, which you can turn off. Mastery is technically astounding. Flawless execution, impossible even to consider on another machine. And Lifespan says, you may wish to play for medals. I think I'll just switch the points on Macbeth again. Bit cryptic that last bit. Either me. The overall verdict is a solid 90%, with the reviewer saying he possibly like it less than anyone else ever in the history of all things, and I think it's fantastically excellent. A bit over the top perhaps, but I suppose everyone was buzzing about Star Fox 64 back then. To be fair, it was a looker, mind you, so were a fair few games on the N64. Good times. This page is an advert from N64 Magazine. It's all about finding Britain's best Lilac Wars player, which we know now as Star Fox 64. Good times. Electronics Boutique, remember them? They've teamed up with the magazine to run this competition. Seems like they're still buzzing from the Mario Kart Championship they did, and now it's all about piloting an R-Wing. They reckon they're after Europe's best pilots too. Bit ambitious maybe? The prize is £500 worth of N64 goodies, which back then, that was a proper haul. You'd be set for Christmas if you won that. To enter, you had to send in your best Lilac Wars scores, either as photos or on video. Imagine sending videos in the post. The top players, just 4 of them, got invited to a final showdown in London at the electronics boutique store on Oxford Street. Fancy that. It's funny looking back, they call it a one-stage only competition, and you could enter as many times as you wanted to improve your score as long as you used a coupon each time. Typical magazine stuff. They even cheekily say, "You'll notice that you haven't got much time to enter," trying to ramp up the pressure as usual. It says to check the rules overleaf. Wouldn't want to miss those out, would you? Good luck to anyone who entered. Hope they got their stack of Nintendo prizes. This page showcases a feature about the Lilac Wars Championship, which, for us old-timers, is Star Fox 64 obviously. It's all about racking up the best score in the game from level 1 to the final showdown with Andros, to win some prizes, maybe even appear in the magazine. There are tips for getting a better score, like single-shotting enemies for bonus points, taking out Starwolf quickly. Yeah, good luck with that, they were always a pain. And apparently, harder routes give you more points. They even mention getting gold medals on every level and playing on expert mode for maximum points, which is just showing off really. The page details how to enter the competition. You basically need to get a top score, photograph or video, your end of game summary or high score table, fill in a coupon. Remember those? And send it all off to Electronics Boutique. Crikey! Electronics Boutique, that takes me back. They even tell you how to take a decent photo of your telescreen without too much glare, and how to record your gameplay on video, assuming you had all the right cables and a VCR handy, of course. The deadline for entries is Wednesday the 12th of November, so about 2.5 weeks from when this issue hit the shelves. Apparently, the top 100 scores will get a mention in the Christmas issue, and the top 4 will be invited to some shindig at the Electronics Boutique in Oxford Street. Sounds like a right laugh if you were into that sort of thing. They even mention that there might be photos from the event in the January issue, so fame and glory were potentially on the cards. Well, maybe not glory, but a mention in N64 Magazine, which was something back then. The page has screenshots of Lilac Wars, including boss battles and the Starwolf team causing trouble as usual, with Leon quipping, "He's too strong." Classic. It's all very nostalgic, reminding you of trying to get the best scores in games and actually sending stuff off in the post to magazines. Simpler times, eh? This page from N64 Magazine, it's got that distinct late 90s look about it, doesn't it? Brings you right back. We're looking at a competition page, all about Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as you probably know it in the US. Electronics Boutique, remember them? They're running a championship, it seems. Warrington, no. There's a leaderboard smack bang in the middle, showing off some seriously impressive scores. Top spot goes to Seth Eagles from Gwynedd, with a whopping 1729. Mad score, that is. Going down the list there are names like Pekka Tarkka from Finland, GK from Darlington, Nick Payne, Mike Hurry, Johnny Town, Chris Turnbull, and a fair few more from London. Looks like a good mix of players from around the UK, and even further afield, trying to prove they are the best at barrel rolling and shooting down Andros's minions. Below the leaderboard is a bit of blurb asking, "So how good is good?" Bit cheeky, implying your score probably isn't up to scratch, but it's all in good fun. They're basically saying they've already printed a Star Fox League table in their I'm the best section, and this championship is going to be even bigger. They're collating a top 100, and even if you're nowhere near the top scores listed here, you could still get a mention. So basically, have a go, why not? Hey. Then at the bottom, there's the entry form. You had to cut this coupon out of the magazine. Carefully, mind you, don't want to ruin the page on the other side. You fill in your details, your pilot name, address and phone number, and importantly, your best total hit score in Lilac Wars. You had to swear you hadn't used cheat devices, and you're using a UK or import version of the game, and you needed to send in a video or photo as proof. All very official for a bit of N64 bragging rights. You'd pop it in the post to their Bath address, wonder if anyone actually won anything good. Russia. And the rules are down the side. Standard stuff, total hit score, from a complete game, level 1 to defeating Andros. No cheats allowed, obviously. Entries had to be in by Wednesday the 12th of November, so yeah, this is definitely from November 97, makes sense. And the editor's decision is final, as always. Good times. Star Fox 64 was a proper blast back then, proper 3D dogfighting action, even if those graphics are a bit blocky looking back now. But at the time, that rumble pack was revolutionary, feeling every laser blast in your hands. Yeah, good memories of Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64, whatever you want to call it. This page is all about multi-racing championship for the N64. It seems they're giving it a look over in N64 Arena magazine. It's been out in Japan and America already, apparently, and they're saying it's trying to be the serious racer on the N64. They gave it a decent 81% in issue 5, which sounds alright, doesn't it? The review talks about how it's trying to fill the gap while we're waiting for Top Gear Rally and Lamborghini 64. Remember the hype around those? Lamborghini 64 was ages away still back then. Apparently multi-racing is all about multi-racing, which is a bit of a daft name really. Each of the 3 tracks branches out, giving you a choice of routes, easy or tricky. And they mention the tracks are often snowy or muddy, making things difficult if you're in a nippy 2-wheel drive, but easier in a slow, particulate-belching, child-murdering 4-wheel drive Land Rover type vehicle. Bit harsh, but you get the idea. Those 4x4s are beasts, yakati. They're saying there are only 3 tracks, which isn't exactly generous, but each track is packed with stuff. Towns, waterfalls, the works, and once you've completed the tracks you've got to do them in mirror mode, and then in a challenge mode against super adept AI cars. Sounds like they are trying to get some replayability in there. Warrant? They mention the analog stick control, which is good, saying it gives you much more control than a D-pad. Gentle nudges for small turns, desperate yanks for power slides. Sounds about right for the N64 stick. They say the 2-wheel drive cars are a bit slippy, while the 4-wheel drives will cling on for dear life. There are a few screenshots dotted around. You can see the sort of blocky graphics you'd expect, with the stop sign looking very polygonal. One shows a yellow Land Rover type thing going through what looks like a town, and another with a white car on a dirt track, with balloons in the sky. It's not the prettiest game, but it looks like it could be a bit of fun. And the also has Mela. Lastly, there's a little box at the bottom saying most of the shortcuts are obvious, but there's a sneaky secret one to find. Always liked hunting for those. This page is a review of Top Gear Rally on the N64, back in November '97. It's framed as a head-to-head test, presumably against another rally game, although it's not explicitly mentioned which one on this page, maybe Sega Rally Championship on Saturn perhaps. This was a time when the N64 was still quite new, and building up its library, so every new game was kind of a big deal. The reviewer, Zai, starts by saying this is the game causing arguments in the office and extreme language. Which is a bit of a cliché for game reviews back then, wasn't it? They reckon it's state-of-the-art and rivals coin-ops, which is high praise in '97 when arcades were still clinging on. They mention the analog stick being used precisely, which was a key selling point of the N64 controller, very fancy at the time. They talk about 4 tracks, plus a secret one, different weather conditions, and 9 cars. Standard stuff for a racing game really. The Seasons mode sounds a bit more interesting, where you progress through different sets of races. They also mention arcade mode, 2-player split screen, and time attack with ghost cars again, all fairly standard modes we'd expect. Customizable cars, and a paint shop, sound like nice touches though. The reviewer points out the camera work and reflections are good, which you can see in the screenshots. There's a shot of a rainy race, a desert scene, and a wintry track, showing off the different environments. There's even a drag racing start light thingy, which is a bit odd for a rally game, but alright, adds variety I suppose. They finish with, "But is it any good? Read on!" Classic reviewer cliffhanger tactic, bit cheesy, but gets you to turn the page, doesn't it? It's all pretty positive so far, but we'll have to see what the full review says to see if it's actually any good or just another slightly above average racer. This page from N64 Magazine delves into Multi-Racing Championship, breaking down the game's 3 courses which they've dubbed a 3-course snack. It seems they reckon multi-racing has loads to offer across its courses. Course 1 is Seaside, apparently dead easy, a bit of a leisurely poodle. They mention shortcuts for off-roaders and a hairpin bend to watch out for. Course 2 is Mountain, described as effectively 2 courses in one for off-roaders, and warns against touching the accelerator too much on the snowy section. Course 3, Downtown, is the hard one, an odd mix of off-road and sharp corners, with a waterfall shortcut. Sounds like they're encouraging a bit of cheeky off-roading, which was always fun. There are screenshots dotted around showing the game in action. It all looks a bit blocky, but that's N64 for you in '97, wasn't it? The right side of the page moves on to styling. The reviewer, ZY, is having a bit of a dig at the graphics. They're suggesting Imagineer, the developers, might have had a dodgy Nintendo programming manual, as the game looks a bit different to other N64 titles. They use words like blocky, angular, and shimmery, saying it looks more like a Saturn or PlayStation game. Ouch. They do concede the courses are packed with detail like spectators, medieval towns, waterfalls, and even dolphins and planes. But they're not exactly blown away by the visuals, saying there's no "cool, look at that" moment. Then they compare it to Top Gear Rally, saying it's a proper N64 game, smooth and magically real, like Pilotwings 64 and Wave Race 64. They reckon Top Gear Rally's roads and hills are more naturally shaped, while multi-racing is a bit more flat and polygony. They also suggest Top Gear Rally is a bit more empty looking, but the N64 effects are better, like reflections on car windows and puddles. They seem to be saying Top Gear Rally is technically better looking, but multi-racing is trying to be more detailed, even if it doesn't quite come off. Interesting comparison at the time, as Top Gear Rally was pretty much the benchmark for N64 races. This page from the magazine is all about Top Gear Rally on the N64. Looks like ZY is having a good crack at it. Right then, handling section first, and it seems they reckon the cars respond well, even saying better than coin-op racers. Bit of a bold claim that back then, wasn't it? They go on about the wheels moving about independently, bit fancy for the time, and if you crest a hill too fast you'll be bouncing around like mad. Sounds about right for a rally game on the N64 actually. Bit of a handful. They're also saying about crashing into barriers to get around corners quicker, which is a bit cheeky, but hey, if it works. Tessie. Then it goes into the 4-course feast, talking about the different tracks. Course 1 is coastline, nice and easy apparently, got a lighthouse and seagulls. The usual seaside stuff. There's even a shortcut if you can find it, sounds like a bit of a cross-country route. Course 2, jungle, described as a bit wiggly and tricky in the middle section, especially with other cars about. Desert is next. Course 3, they say it's a favourite, bits of city and mostly desert. And there's a left-hand route that's easier. Handy tip that. Course 4 is mountain, apparently the best looking and the most straightforward, just flat out and bouncing over crash barriers. Sounds like my kind of track, less thinking, more pedal to the metal. Down the side there's a secrets bit, saying if you complete all the seasons you get even more races and a secret vehicle. A milk float. A milk float. Seriously? Apparently it's blisteringly fast though, despite looking like a milk float. And then there's a helmet car and a bubble car to unlock as well. Oh, and the whole championship goes into mirror mode, which is a clever way to extend the game I suppose. And then they tease a 5th hidden track, something post-apocalyptic, which sounds a bit bonkers, doesn't it? Finally, there's a HMM section musing about the cars in the game. They're saying they're ostensibly made up, yeah right, but they look a lot like real cars, don't they? They mention the PS looking like a Porsche 959, LD like a Lancia Delta, and SP like a Toyota Supra. Yeah, you could see that even back then, they weren't exactly hiding their inspirations. The reviewer reckons there are loads of others too. M3, IPCEES, N5, RS, all twins in the real world. Bit of a spotter's guide for car buffs, that bit. All in all, sounds like Top Gear Rally is shaping up to be a decent racer on the N64. Bit of arcade fun with some rally flavour. This page depicts a review of the game Multi-Racing Championship for the N64, giving it a decent score of 71%. Looking back, it seems they rated it on visuals, which got a 6 out of 10, sounds an 8, and surprisingly mastery and lifespan both only got 6 and 5 respectively. The reviewer's eye reckons it's visually alright, if a bit rough around the edges, and the co-driver speech is a bit repetitive, which I suppose was common in those days. Mastery being a 6 implies it's maybe not the deepest game, and lifespan of 5 suggests it runs out of steam pretty quick, lasting hours rather than days in terms of replayability. They reckon it's a nippy and accessible racer, but ultimately runs out of road too soon, which is fair enough. The ownership section talks about how quickly you can finish the main championship in Multi-Racing Championship compared to Top Gear Rally. Apparently Top Gear Rally lets you get away with coming in third as long as you get enough points, which is a bit more forgiving then, eh? They mention mirror mode unlocks after a couple of attempts, which was always a nice bonus back then. There's talk of different vehicles and shortcuts, classic racing game stuff. Warrington Mailvor. The reviewer suggests picking a 4-wheel drive truck with ocean logos for some reason, and just taking all the shortcuts to win. Cheeky. They then go on about Top Gear Rally being slow and boring to start with because you're stuck with slow cars, but then it gets better with faster cars and nasty weather. Apparently on the professional setting in Top Gear Rally it gets really hard, especially on the snowy jungle track. Mirrored, which sounds like a right laugh, or maybe controller throwing frustration. There's a section on Top Gear for 2, saying if you fancy playing 2-player you should go for the arcade mode in Top Gear Rally, and that Multi-Racing Championship's 2-player mode takes a while to get into but is competitive once you do. They point out in Top Gear Rally's 2-player it's just you and your mate on the track, no other cars, which is different to Multi-Racing Championship. And they say bizarrely Top Gear Rally doesn't let you use the better cars and tracks until you've unlocked them in the single-player championship, which is a bit daft if you just want a quick blast with a mate, isn't it? They conclude that while both games have split screen, Multi-Racing has coin-op style checkpoints, and Top Gear Rally does it in a separate arcade mode. So overall, sounds like Multi-Racing Championship is a decent enough racer for a quick go, but maybe lacks the depth of Top Gear Rally for the long haul, especially for 2 players. This page depicts a review spread from an N64 magazine. Seems like we're looking at a comparison between Multi-Racing Championship and Top Gear Rally. Ah yes, those halcyon days of 1997, where every other game was a racer on the new 64-bit Wonder console. We've got a splash of screenshots showing off both games. Paint shop mode in Top Gear Rally looks a bit like Mario Paint for cars, letting you tinker with the colors and bits and bobs. There's also a shot of a rather fetching milk float, apparently a secret car in Top Gear, and it's claimed to be surprisingly nippy. Gotta love those quirky British secrets in games back then. The other screenshots show in-game racing action from both titles, typical third-person perspective. There's a table laying out the facts and figures comparing the two. Multi-Racing Championship seems to have fewer tracks, cars and CPU opponents, but also fewer views. Top Gear Rally boasts more of everything, and even has hidden tracks and cars, and weather effects like rain and snow. Fancy stuff for the time. Both use the controller pack for saving, Rumble Pack compatible, standard fare really. Top Gear Rally is penciled in for November, Multi-Racing Championship for October, so Top Gear is the one to look forward to after Multi-Racing then if you're keeping score. Rulsa Hazik Orchestra. The review itself, under the headline Verdict, goes into the usual spiel about N64 racers needing to be more than just coin-op ports. They mention Sega Rally and Ridge Racer as benchmarks, which were indeed top-tier arcade racers back then. Apparently Multi-Racing is seen as a bit more accessible, but Top Gear Rally is more N64-worthy and involving. They talk about its uncanny fluidity and belief-defyingly realistic handling. Bit strong words there, but hey, it was a new console. The reviewer, Jonathan Davies, reckons they finished Multi-Racing Championship pretty quickly and moved on, but Top Gear Rally has more staying power. He concludes that whilst Top Gear Rally can be annoying at times, it's a racer to be proud of for the N64. And look at that, a score of 86% splashed across the page. Right then, must be a decent game according to the magazine, though maybe not quite perfect then if it's annoying at times, eh? They've also given it individual scores. 8 for visuals and mastery, 7 for sounds, and a whopping 9 for lifespan, which suggests it's got legs, or wheels in this case. Overall, sounds like Top Gear Rally is the one to go for if you had to pick. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 8 it looks like, is delving into the multiplayer modes of Baku Baku Bomb. Remember that one? It was one of those import titles, Japanese and US only back then, which this magazine seemed to be covering a bit, especially if it wasn't out in the UK yet. They were keeping us informed on what we were missing out on, I suppose. Cummils. Anyway, Baku Baku Bomb. They say it's like Bomberman but in 3D. Bit of a no-brainer really, with the N64 being all about the polygons. They're looking at the multiplayer arenas, and they've picked out 3 to show. Cummils. First up is Arena 1, the Rock Garden. Simple enough, rocks disappear quick, making it a bit more open, and they reckon you can use a shotgun to launch bombs at people. Sounds a bit chaotic. The screenshot shows a green grassy area, with brown rock things, and little Bomberman characters running around. Looks quite basic, typical early 3D stuff. Danger. Next is Arena 2, the Ocean Rig. This one's got staircases and platforms over water, and apparently if you fall off, it's straight to Davy Jones' locker. Bit dramatic. They mention you can't see where you are going sometimes, which probably means the camera angles are a bit dodgy like they often were back then. The picture is all blue and grey with platforms over water, looks a bit more complex than the Rock Garden. Finally, there's Arena 3, the Ziggurat. This one sounds a bit more interesting. You grab extra bombs at the top of a ziggurat, and then bomb everyone below. A bit of King of the Hill, bomb style. They reckon you can rain bombs down on attacking infidels. Bit strong that wording for a game review, isn't it? Screenshot shows a yellow pyramid-like structure, with characters battling on top. There's a little box at the top right of the page, with a screenshot from what I guess is in-game, with some explosions, and a character on some steps. The text next to it says, "Nice explosions, yes but, well I've a jigsaw that needs doing." Sounds like ZY, the reviewer, isn't completely blown away, even with the explosions. Bit of a lukewarm comment if you ask me. Worry. So yeah, Baku Bomb, multiplayer arenas. Looks like they were trying to bring Bomberman into 3D, with mixed results maybe. Probably fun with mates after school though, if you could get your hands on an import copy. This page is from N64 Magazine, must be back in '97 judging by the date at the bottom there, November. It's a look at Baku Bomberman under the import arena section, so one of those games we had to get shipped over from Japan. They've clearly been waiting for this one. The headline says, "We've been looking forward to it for months," which is always a good sign. But then it goes, "and well, oh dear. ERMAN in massive orange letters." ERMAN probably means Bomberman. Bit of a weird way to put it, but magazine headlines were always a bit try-hard back then, weren't they? So maybe it's not quite lived up to the hype then. There's a little box with details about Baku Bomberman, saying it's by Hudson, out now in Japan, 64 megabytes, which was pretty decent size for a cart back then, plays 1 to 4 players, needs a controller pack for backup saves, and was due out in the UK on the 14th of November. Price is about 35 quid, a fair whack for an import game. Keepow. Above the big ERMAN are some screenshots and little speech bubble type things. One mentions natty bosses and sharp spike and resulting leapage, which sounds like typical Bomberman platforming stuff with tricky bits. The other one says, definite air of menace. Yoicks! So at least they seem to think it's got some atmosphere. Down below are sections for Arena 4 the Great Hall, Arena 5 the Long Grass, and Arena 6 the Power-Up Pit. Each has a screenshot. The Great Hall looks like your classic Bomberman grid but in 3D. They're saying you can run on the rafters, and they can't see anyone because it's 3D, or most of the hall floor, not sure what that's about, maybe a bit confusing in 3D. The Long Grass looks, well, grassy, and they're saying you can hardly see the bombs or power-ups because of the thick vegetation, calling it a criminal absence of imagination. Bit harsh. The Power-Up Pit is about all the power-ups being in the center and needing to be careful. Sounds like a bit of a free-for-all. Overall, it feels like they were excited, but maybe Baku Bomberman isn't quite the classic they were hoping for. Oh dear. ERMAN kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Still, Bomberman in 3D on the N64, we were probably all going to give it a go anyway, weren't we? This page depicts a review of Planet Bomberman in Import Arena. Right, Planet Bomberman. Sounds a bit poncy, doesn't it? Anyway, it's described as a reworking of old Super Bomberman ideas, split into 5 themed worlds each with a big bad bomber to defeat. Apparently you get new abilities as you go to solve puzzles and nip back and forth between areas. Malbait. There are snippets on the Green Gardens and Blue Resort levels. Green Gardens looks like your typical Bomberman blocky maze, with a tip about sliding bombs under caged areas. Best bit apparently is floating down the stream. Sounds thrilling. Blue Resort is all about deadly water, bridges and bounce pads to get around and trigger switches. They even mention pop-up fishies, bless. Best bit there is the little soldiers with guns. On patrol. Honestly, soldiers with guns in Bomberman, it's getting a bit serious, isn't it? Worry. Down below there's a section called Robotic Plastic Fantastic about the Super B-Diamond toys. Seems like they were quite the thing in Japan, these little robot exoskeleton blasters. They even mention one inside a clipped-together unicorn and another, merged with a 64-bit development team. Bonkers. If you fancy buying one, you're told to ring Project K, whatever that is. Must be some import place. Dermuckers. Finally, there's a bit called U, which is a quote from someone, maybe the reviewer ZY, pronounced Zai, I suppose. He's rambling about the game's solo puzzle mode not being up to much, and saying it's really the multiplayer battle mode that made Bomberman famous. 4 human players. Simple concept, smash or be smashed. He reckons that's the proper Bomberman experience, establishing superiority over your mates. Fair enough, that's always been the best laugh with Bomberman, hasn't it? Settle a few scores. This page from an old N64 mag takes us back to November 1997 it seems, and it's all about Import Arena and Baku Bomberman. We've got 2 levels being previewed here, White Ice and Red Mountain, both sounding pretty treacherous. And White Ice sounds a right pain, with icy surfaces and blizzards, the kind where you'd be cursing the telly when you fell off. Apparently setting off a bomb in the wrong spot causes an avalanche, which is just typical, isn't it? The screenshots show a very snowy level, you can see the character starting off, and then looking properly panicked as the snow starts falling. It mentions the camera view being reversed too, which is just the sort of thing to throw you off completely. G, 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 Jory, G, 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 which looks like a fiery hellscape. It's all destructible rocks and lava eruptions. Sounds like you'll be falling off edges even more than on the ice level, and dodging magma rain. The screenshot is a bit of a shocker, showing the Bomberman character in what looks like a proper volcanic pit. The reviewer, Zai, even says, with one look at this hellish vision, will yelp like a girl. Bit dramatic, but you get the idea. The article mentions the new 3D gimmick for Bomberman on the N64, and how they've gone for a more interpretative approach to gameplay, which is a bit waffly if you ask me. They're clearly trying to jazz it up from the old 2D maze formula, but it sounds like it might be a bit of a compromise. They do moan about the arenas being too small, and the vanishing point making things tricky to see. There are a couple of plastique technique tips too. Number 1 is about sliding bombs diagonally. Apparently they just keep going and can snake their way through blocks. Number 2 is good old manual detonation, which they're happy is still in there, letting you slide a bomb and then detonate it with the Z trigger. There ain't a thing they can do about it, they say, getting a bit carried away there. Overall, it's a preview of Baku Bomberman, trying to sound exciting but also a bit worried about the changes to the classic formula. Sounds like it could be a bit hit and miss this 3D Bomberman, but you'd probably still give it a go back then, wouldn't you? This page is a right blast from the past, isn't it? It's all about Bomberman 64, or Baku B-Man as they call it here for some reason, in this Import Arena section. Crikey, remember importing games? Anyway, they're showing off all these new tricks Bomberman can do in 3D, like bouncing bombs and making bomb towers. Sounds a bit complicated for Bomberman if you ask me, but alright. They're running through the power-ups and bomb types. Bits like bounce bombs, tower bombs, blast bombs, balloon bombs, pretty standard Bomberman fare, just with a bit of a 3D twist. And then there's talk about a Man at Tent section, which is about customizing your Bomberman with hats and shades and the like. You could even save your custom dude on the controller pack to show off at your mate's house fancy. Bro Jommy. Looks like ZY Nicholson reviewed it, and bless him he's not exactly blown away. He mentions the single player mode is a bit tedious, and the multiplayer, which should be Bomberman's bread and butter, is a bit random and has lost some of the quick-witted strategy. Ouch. He gives it a 50% verdict, calling it a genuine disappointment. Fair play ZY, tell it like it is. He sums it up as briefly diverting but really not up to scratch for proper Bomberman fans. Says they've lost the thread this time. Maybe should have stuck to 2D then, eh? Still, Bomberman, eh? Good times. This page is an import review from N64 Magazine, taking a look at J-League Dynamite Soccer on the N64. It seems like ZY, the reviewer, is trying to figure out if this Japanese footy game is any good, especially compared to FIFA, which was the big name back then. He's saying Dynamite? Hardly right in the headline, so you know it's not going to be getting 90% or anything. There's a bit called Team 17 Inches, which is quite funny, basically taking the mick out of some of the J-League team names by comparing them to English Premiership teams of the time, with some rather cheeky descriptions. For example, Avispa Fukuoka are compared to unfavoured Wimbledon, Sanfrecce Hiroshima are like difficult to locate Leicester, and Grampus 8 is apparently like Aces Man Utadid, which is a bit of a stretch. It's that typical magazine humour, you know? Warrington Maida. Looking at the screenshots, it's definitely got that older style of football game look, a bit like Super Soccer on the SNES, which he even mentions. He says the graphics are visually plain but an improvement on the SNES games, which is fair enough. More. The reviewer seems a bit on the fence. He mentions the controls are a bit basic and the football mechanics aren't the best compared to International Superstar Soccer, which was Konami's big football game back then, and rightly so. ISS was pretty slick. He talks about missing things like back heels and flicks, the fancy stuff, but then he also says there's something strangely enjoyable about it, and that if you persevere, you might get hooked. He even mentions the dribbling being surprisingly good. So it sounds like a bit of a mixed bag, not amazing but maybe worth a look if you're desperate for a football fix on your N64 and you've played FIFA to death. He calls it middle off the road, but says it can keep you on the edge of your seat. No really. Classic magazine review. A bit of a roller coaster of opinions. This page from N64 Magazine is diving into J-League Dynamite Soccer 64, which they've put in the Import Arena section, so you know straight away it's one of those Japanese games we probably weren't meant to get over here. They're calling it a poorer brother to ISS 64 right off the bat, which isn't exactly a glowing start, is it? It looks like they are saying it's got the Japanese league teams, East and West, rather than proper international teams, comparing it to an Arsenal versus Tottenham derby, but then downgrading that to something like Exeter versus Torquay, which is a bit harsh but funny. The screenshots show it's definitely a football game, with players on a pitch and goalmouth action. One image even has "GOAL" splashed across it in big letters, just in case you weren't sure what happened. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, mentions you can use slide tackles, which is apparently a key part of any N64 football fan's game. Good to know. There's a bit called Route 1 giving you tips on how to score, basically cutting in from the wing and shooting diagonally. Sounds like your typical cheesy goal trick to rinse your mates with. They also talk about an off-on-one feature where the CPU tells you exactly why you were offside, which is pretty advanced for the time. Konami didn't even think of that apparently. Cheeky dig. They've got these little numbered icons, giving scores for different things. Accessibility is called hard, saying it's unlikely you'd buy it anyway, bit blunt. Visuals are called really good, saying even the SNES could handle it, which seems like faint praise. Sounds are apparently awful, with the crowd being as exciting as Kenny Dalglish, and the sound effects being abysmal. Ouch. Mastery is marked as, well, it's not quite ISS64, is it? Perfunctory. Again, not exactly selling it. Lifespan says it's alright once you get into it, but then the verdict slams it again, calling the appearances deceptive, and saying it's about as fun as a pulled hamstring at first, but you might enjoy it a bit if you persevere. The final score is 66%, which is pretty average, isn't it? They've slapped a "you have to stick with it" mind tag on the verdict, so maybe it's a grower, not a shower. This page from N64 Magazine, looks like issue 8, is a review of GQ World Soccer 3, which the reviewer Tim Weaver reckons is basically the Japanese version of ISS64, or International Superstar Soccer 64 as we know it over here. It's got a big splashy title, and some screenshots of the game, you know, blokes in footy kits running around a pitch. Apparently this GQ version is out now in Japan, but unlikely for us Brits to get. Import only if you're flush. It's priced at 7,500 yen, which is about £40 notes at the time. They give it a solid 91%, saying it's a cracking football game, though maybe a smidge below the pale ISS64 we already had. The review talks about how it's the version 2 of ISS64, or maybe 3 if you're being picky about Japanese releases. They admit it's hard to keep track of these things, especially with names like GQ. Apparently there are cosmetic differences between this version and the European one. Teams have been changed, for instance Poland, Austria, Greece and even Scotland and Wales are out, replaced by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran and Canada. Bit of a random swap around if you ask me. Who would pick Iran over Scotland to play as Jeresid? They mention some extra celebrations when you score, players diving into the crowd or doing an Asprilla-style flip, which sounds a bit daft but I guess adds some flair. The music is apparently a bit iffy, with baby-voiced singers, but the commentator, a chap named Tom G, is apparently good. The reviewer reckons it's still outstanding visually, sounds are alright despite the music, it's got great gameplay, and will last you a while. They compare the mastery to Virtua Striker in the arcades, saying this is better. Accessibility is apparently tricky unless you've played Perfect Striker already. In the verdict box, it says it's slightly inferior to the pale ISS64, but still breathtaking. So basically, it's ISS64, with a few tweaks and different teams, good score but probably not worth importing unless you're a die-hard collector, or really fancy playing as Saudi Arabia in your virtual footy. This page is taking a gander at Mischief Makers, and it's in the import arena section, so you know back then that meant getting your game shipped over from Japan, not like today's downloads. The reviewer, Jess, seems a bit perplexed by it all, calling it unfathomable and weird. To be fair, a lot of these Japanese games were a bit out there back then, weren't they? He does draw a comparison to Super Mario 64, with the hints, everyone was playing Mario 64 at the time, so that makes sense. There's a screenshot showing Marina's evil twin, Kalina, causing a bit of bother. The villagers look proper spooked. Apparently the Japanese title was Go Go, or even Yuk Yuk. Warrington also has a new, try saying that down the pub. They mention this Mez hint character spouting cryptic nonsense. Comparing it to Star Fox 64, they actually think Mischief Makers is more fun, which is a big statement. There's some weirdness about Chappie and the blood of the Blockman body, just typical game silliness really. They've given it a massive 90% mind you, that's a serious score back then. Breaking it down, it's 7s for visuals and sound, another 7 for mastery, whatever that really means, and a 9 for lifespan, so it'll keep you busy. Jess reckons it breaks all the rules and is full of imagination, which is probably true. They've even quoted some of the game's dialogue, like, "Let's water the flowers," then this moody line, "Shut up! Leave me alone! This is my life!" And there's mention of a cheeky sealers and sacrificing squirrels. Sounds like a right laugh. They even bring up a Goemon review Zai did previously. Bit of self-referencing there. Overall it's a bit of a head-scratcher, but in a good way it seems. This page from N64 Magazine must be from back in the day, probably around 97 given the Mario Kart 64 focus. It's got a help wanted advert at the top left. They were after experts to write game guides, proper job for a dedicated gamer back then. Then the main feature is a how-to guide to win every single time in Mario Kart 64's battle mode. Bit of a bold claim. Written by some readers, Daniel Glenfield and Nathan Oliver, it says. There's a publishing SEC section where the mag talks about being impressed by reader contributions, and how they're dedicating 4 pages a month to game features from readers, and even giving away a jacket. Sounds like they were proper keen on reader content, which was always cool to see. They mentioned Daniel and Nathan's battle mode guide as the kind of thing they're after. They're after about 2,000 words of expert advice, focusing on one aspect of a game, not the whole thing. The battle mode guide itself is split into sections like, before you start, with tips. There's repeated attacks, suggesting hitting opponents again as they get up using triple shells. Ramming encourages getting a turbo start and ramming folk, especially with heavy characters like Donkey Kong, Wario and Bowser against lighter ones. Then quick spin is about doing a spin move to quickly turn around and fire red shells, which is a decent trick. And finally, a funny one, too much pasta Mario, saying Mario can somehow ram Toad and make him lose a balloon, same as the heavy characters, but poor old Luigi can't. Classic Mario Kart 64 oddities, you'd spend ages figuring those things out with your mates. At the bottom it's got the address to send your guide to the jacket zone, and to remember to include your jacket size if you win, naturally. Issue 8 of N64 Magazine, taking me right back. This page is all about winning every single time in Mario Kart 64's battle mode, classic N64 multiplayer fun, eh? It's got a bunch of tips and tricks, some of them are a bit cheeky, bordering on are you actually serious kind of stuff. They've got all the staple moves like the sneaky invincibility trick, where you can still get them even after your star power runs out for a bit. Then there's the banana tactic, which is basically just being a bit of a menace with bananas, scattering them everywhere. They also mention the bombastic mini boost for catching up, breaks, for outsmarting someone chasing you with a power-up, and a banana counterattack to save yourself from losing a balloon. There's even a banana barricade for blocking passageways. The super bomb tip is pretty smart actually, keeping a weapon behind you when you're down to your last balloon for a bit of payback. Where'd my bomb go? Is about dropping a bomb right after you've used invincibility, a bit of a cheap trick if you ask me. Double the punishment is a bit more strategic, knowing where people respawn and laying traps. Then teamwork. Well, that's just teaming up, hardly rocket science, is it? And finally, suggests a cheeky elbow in the ribs if all else fails. Very British that. Down at the bottom, there's a section called Psychological Edge, which is rather amusing. Method 1 foot suggests laughing like a maniac to psych out your opponent, and method 2 feet is about bluffing a red shell attack. Apparently these are considered cheating by some, which is a bit rich, isn't it? It's all part of the fun, winding up your mates on the N64. It says here if you use these too much you might get a smack in the mouth from your friend. Sounds about right for a proper N64 battle session back in the day. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine issue 8 November 97 takes us right back to the multiplayer madness of Mario Kart 64 battle mode, specifically the Big Donut and Block Fort arenas. Block Fort. Detonating. Anyone who played this back in the day knows it was just brilliant for causing absolute carnage with your mates. Detonate. The article kicks off with Big Donut, admitting it can be a bit tedious if players just try to stay out of reach of each other. They suggest a speed tip for power sliding and mini boosting to catch up, which is fair enough. We all tried to master that trick back then. Then there's a red shell tactic. Fire it backwards and swerve. Cheeky. Where to drop 'em? Advises grouping bananas and fake item boxes in that central area. A classic trap really. Everyone fell for that. Moving on to Block Fort, which they rightly call more exciting, we get into the proper tactics. Aerial assault. Firing red shells from above. Obvious but effective. Camouflage suggests hiding bananas on the yellow fort. Blending in. Sneaky. Surprise! And surprise! 2 are about banana and fake item traps on ramps and corners, good for catching out those overeager racers. The dormant killer is a bit more involved, getting to the top fort and boxing yourself in with items, waiting to ambush anyone foolish enough to approach. Bit of a camper's tactic, that one, but hey, all's fair in love, and Mario Kart, right? Warrington North? Then there's Fatal Fall, just firing green shells down to knock people off the edge. Proper mean that is. And finally, a Fatal Fall counterattack, grabbing a star and sneaking up to the top whilst invincible, a good way to turn the tables on those green shell chuckers. Looking at the screenshots, it's all classic low-poly N64. Goodness, brings back memories of shouting at the telly with your mates until the early hours. They weren't wrong, Block Fort was, and still is, a proper laugh in battle mode. Good times. This page showcases some top tips and tricks for Mario Kart 64's battle mode, focusing on the double deck and skyscraper arenas. Battle mode. Proper fun that was back in the day. Much better than just racing round and round, wasn't it? For double deck, they're talking about cheeky corner cutting around the hole in the middle, useful for dodging shells apparently, but sounds like you'd end up looking a right muppet if you messed it up and fell down. Then there's the banana barricade, which is pretty self-explanatory. Just litter the place with bananas to stop people getting near you. Clever stuff. And a slightly sneaky where did that banana come from tip where you chuck bananas through the ceiling from below. Proper underhanded tactics, I like it. They even mention a helter-skelter slide. to escape opponents, which sounds a bit risky but might be worth a go. Over on Skyscraper they call it a fast-paced battle arena, which is probably right. All those pits to fall into made it pretty tense. The main tip here is escape from shells, by jumping over the central pit with the R button if you've got enough speed. Sounds a bit hair-raising, especially with a shell up your jacksie. There's also a semi-solid wall trick, using the walls of the archways to get away, which is probably quite handy. And a banana barricade, 45-degree version, for the archways, which sounds like a good way to funnel people into your banana traps. All in all, some decent pointers here to give you an edge in battle mode. Probably spent hours on Double Deck trying to master some of these myself back in '97. Good times. This page is all about conquering the harder parts of Blastcore on the N64, penned by Jez Bickham. It's a helping hand for those of us struggling with the tougher levels, especially if you're after all the scientists and those pesky communication points you need to locate. They're even warning you it's going to be a bit of a challenge, talking about teeth-grinding difficulty. Charming. There's also a bit in a box about the PAL version. Remember those days of dodgy conversions? Well, apparently this one isn't too bad. Full screen, which is a bonus, and mostly full speed, although they do say some of the vehicles like Backlash and Thunderfist are a tad sluggish. Still, an 8 out of 10 for the conversion, so Rare did a decent job on that front. Blastcore itself, from what they're saying, sounds like a proper blast, all about smashing things up and causing a bit of glorious chaos. The screenshots do look rather good, I must admit. This page, right then, it's all about Blastcore, isn't it? Classic N64 stuff, proper head-scratching puzzle action, but with diggers and bulldozers smashing things up. Not bad, eh? This is from the how-to section, giving us the lowdown on some of the trickier bits in the game, the really hard bits in Blastcore as they've called it. Bit dramatic that, but they were always like that in magazines back then, weren't they? At the top we've got some things to remember tips, like making sure you complete a level fully rather than just bailing out, good for saving your progress apparently, and that you need to smash everything, even statues, to get all the points. It also mentions those RDU things, radio detonation units I think, and how they don't always connect up neatly, so you've got to explore properly. And finally, a bit of a warning about the time limit and the pressure of the nuclear carrier, telling you to keep calm and use the brakes. Sensible advice for a game that can get a bit frantic. Then we've got tips for specific levels. First up is Argent Towers. They say the first comms point is on a rocky bit to the left, and then you got to push a stone block to get to a lower level, exit your vehicle, get in a ramdozer, and use a TNT block to blow a door. Sounds like a right faff, doesn't it? Then Carrick Point, where the first comms point is on an island, the second in the castle. They even mention a Thunderfist in the car park to help you get up there, and a ballista to destroy a boat. Finally, Blackridge Works. The first comms point is apparently right where you start, behind some buildings, and the second one is in a big area of RDUs near the end of the level. So yeah, typical helpful hints page from back in the day. Blastcore was a good game, wasn't it? Proper N64 quirky. Remember spending ages trying to get gold medals on all the levels. Proper completionist stuff. This page probably saved a few of us from throwing our controllers at the telly back in '97. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine looks like it's the how-to section, and it's all about getting through some tricky bits in games. It seems to be focusing on a game where you drive vehicles and blow things up. Looks like Blastcore, doesn't it? Remember that one? Mad, isn't it? Using diggers and dump trucks to stop nukes. Proper bonkers game, but strangely addictive at the time. The first bit is for Havoc District, and it mentions a convoluted cleanup operation. Sounds about right for Blastcore. Apparently you need to leave a J-bomb in a glass house. No idea what that's about now, but it probably made sense back then. It talks about destroying buildings and a bridge, using a ballista to destroy a boat, and finding spheres hovering over water. Then it mentions an underwater tunnel to a glass house to get a Starsky and Hutch car and collect submerged RDUs. Bit of a weird level if you ask me. Next up is Shuttle Gully, described as easy peasy, which, knowing games mags, probably means it's still a pain. The communication point is apparently by the bridge. Righto. Outland Farm is next, and they say you need to go under the bridge, over a jump, and around a corner to find the first comms point. Then follow a gully to a road and over a bridge for the second one, surrounded by RDUs. RDUs everywhere in this game, eh? Then there's Ironstone Mine. This one is about finding Thunderfist near the end of the level and suddenly becoming much easier. Train sheds are involved. To get a scientist, you need to use Ramdozer, in a little cave, drive it on a cliffside track, load TNT with a crane, and lift it over a railway to expose a tunnel. Bit of a faff just for a scientist, but hey, that's Blastcore for you. Huzzah indeed. Finally, Beaten Tracks, which is apparently a bit tricky. You need to take the train to the station, run around to find Ramdozer, flatten a small building, and lift Ramdozer over the tracks with the crane. Then demolish a big building with TNT and drive down the road to find comms points and RDUs, and even a police car on the other side. Sounds like they really crammed everything into these levels. Ooh. Looking back, Blast Corps was a bit odd, wasn't it? But we all played it, didn't we? Just shows you what the N64 was like. A bit quirky, but good fun at the time. This page from N64 Magazine, back when we all used to actually buy mags for our game tips, is all about getting through the really tough bits in Blast Corps. Blast Corps, what a game that was. Properly mental, driving diggers and stuff to clear up buildings before a missile truck goes boom. So they've got walkthroughs here for a few levels. First up is Ebony Coast. Sounds sunny, doesn't it? Looks like you're pushing a TNT block with the Ramdozer into a railway tunnel. Classic Blast Corps, causing mayhem. Then it's about getting another TNT block on a train and blowing up some big stone heads, maybe get some readies for that, which I guess is just points. Apparently if you fly back along the tracks there's more comms points, and a scientist by a big stone arch. Sounds like a proper treasure hunt. Rigessy. Next is Echo Marshes, which sounds a bit less inviting than Ebony Coast. This one's causing confusion apparently. You need to destroy buildings to let a carrier through, fly over a hill to find a train, plug a gap with it, then go back for a J-bomb and blow up offices and barges. Sounds like a right kerfuffle to be honest, typical Blast Corps complexity. They mention comms points hidden in red gas and on pillars, so lots to find if you're a completionist. Tempest City is next, and they're talking about a castle-like cliff, saying you need to collect ammo and blast a middle section away to make a ramp. Bit of a puzzle solver this game, isn't it? At the top of the ramp there's a comms point, crates, and a scientist hiding behind some skulls. Crates counting as buildings, that's a bit cheeky. Lastly, there's Glory Crossing, where this eccentric old buzzard scientist is hiding in an underpass. They always put the scientists in the weirdest places, don't they? Accessible through an unhidden underpass in the left side of the main buildings. So, another scientist to rescue for your collection. Looks like this page is giving you a helping hand to grab all the secrets and points in Blast Corps, for those of us who maybe weren't quite skilled enough to find it all ourselves back in the day. Good times, good times. This page is all about getting stuck into Blast Corps, showing us the ropes for two of its notoriously tricky levels, Diamond Sands and Oyster Harbour. Blast Corps, blimey, that was a game, wasn't it? Proper head scratcher, not just a mindless blast mup. They're saying Diamond Sands is one of the most frustratingly difficult examples of gaming ever, even mentioning epilepsy, inducing pillar jumping in Turok as a benchmark. That's some claim. Apparently, the trick in Diamond Sands is to only smash half the sheds on one side, then cross over and do the other half. Sounds simple enough written down, doesn't it? They reckon if you can do it in under 20 attempts, you're a genius, and it took them over 1 million goes. Crikey. Moving on to Oyster Harbour, this one looks like a proper puzzle with crates, barges, and TNT. You're driving the Ramdozer, naturally, and you've got to shoot crates, get TNT, use cranes, and shift blocks onto barges. They even warn you about the barges being confusing when they don't park properly, which, knowing games of this era, probably means they just glitch out on you. The last bit involves pushing TNT over barges to a final building. Sounds like a right kerfuffle. The reviewer seems to be having a laugh with it all, even if they are probably tearing their hair out trying to complete these levels. Blast Corps was certainly something different back then, wasn't it? Proper N64 era puzzling madness. This page from N64 Magazine, right, it's taking a look at some of the trickier bits in games for the N64, focusing on a game called Blast Corps. Remember that one? It was a bit of a looker back then, all about demolition and causing mayhem. Page tricky aims. The page is split into sections. First up is Crystal Rift, which sounds like a level in Blast Corps. They're talking about communication points and scientists you need to rescue. There's mention of a Ramdozer vehicle which they say you should grab as soon as you can, not being the niftiest otherwise apparently. Bit sarcastic there, eh? They even drop an A-Team van reference, saying, pity the fool. Which is a bit of alright, always liked a bit of A-Team. Then there's a section on vehicles. They run through a few of the Blast Corps vehicles like the Ramdozer itself, saying it's good for flattening buildings in a gentle zigzag. Skyfall, Backlash, Sideswipe, Ballista, Cyclone Suit, Thunderfist and J-Bomb are also mentioned. Blimey, they had a lot of vehicles in that game, didn't they? Each with its own quirky trick, like the Cyclone Suit being a bit idiosyncratic, and the Thunderfist being agonizingly slow. Sounds about right. Some of those vehicles were a bit clunky, but that was part of the charm, wasn't it? Finally, they have a section called Sneaky Tricks, Get Off on the Right Foot, Z-Trick, and spooky are the headings. These are little tips for getting ahead, like stamping on the gas at the start of a race, or some weird trick with parking next to a building to make it collapse. Strange, but occasionally useful, they say about that Z trick. And spooky is about re-entering a race level to get your ghost back, something about icky ectoplasm business. Bit odd, but gaming was full of these strange little quirks back then, wasn't it? Oh. The whole page is styled up in that typical N64 Magazine way, bright colors, and bold text. It's a decent little guide if you were stuck on Blastcore back in '97, and a bit of a nostalgia trip flipping through it now. ZY, the reviewer, or whoever wrote this, seems to be having a bit of fun with it all too, with the sarcastic comments and pop culture references. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, back in '97 mind you, is all about bonus levels for Carmageddon 64. Remember that one? They were touting these levels as proper trickier challenges, not just the usual guff. Apparently, they've crammed in secret shortcuts that are gold medal worthy, which is a bit of alright if you ask me. They even mention using the A-Team van or the Starsky and Hutch car for some of these, which sounds like a laugh. It seems the reviewer, or whoever wrote this, is having a bit of a giggle about how tough these levels are supposed to be, saying they'd slow down even 20-somethings. Bit cheeky. They mention the hot rod and the police car as being fast but hard to handle, especially compared to the Ram Dozer. They've got little sections for each level, like Bison Ridge, where you just turn right after the jump to cut half the course easy peasy. Then there's Glander's Ranch, telling you to look out for arrows for shortcuts over rough ground. Cooter Creek sounds a bit more involved, driving past trees and doing some slingshotting, and you need the Ram Dozer for a comms point, backwards from the start, whatever that's about. Jade Plateau needs the Ram Dozer too, to plow through buildings after a bridge. Skerries has a tunnel through a cliff after the second bridge. Moraine Chase wants you to turn left after the third wall for cross-country fun, and definitely don't rejoin the track too soon. Corvine Bluff is about sticking to the right to avoid watery speed sapping, with another comms point down by the river. And then there's Space, the final demolition shuttle clear, which sounds utterly bonkers. Apparently Backlash is hidden there, and it's all about causing devastation to find an office, do the usual, raise everything, and then the shuttle can land. Finally there's Moon, with dump trucks on buildings and low gravity, all very silly and very Carmageddon. Good times, good times. This page from the magazine is all about getting through Blastcore on the N64, which, looking back, was a bit of a weird and wonderful game, wasn't it? They're calling it the really hard bits, which is probably fair enough. Some of those levels could be right sods. First up is Magma Peak, and they're not wrong calling it a swine. Lava everywhere, instant death if you touch anything. They reckon you need to hover about a hair's breadth above the magma. Sounds stressful just reading it. Apparently you're collecting beacons and spheres around the volcano walls, so precision is key. They even suggest using short bursts of the J-bomb thrusters to turn on the spot. Remember J-bomb? Bit of a clunky control system at times, but you got used to it. Then there's Mercury. They say choose the Ram Dozer, and it's a 4-lap race against the clock. Keep inside, don't clip the corners, the usual racing advice. Something about racing physics and catching air being bad, so stay on the ground. Sounds like a standard race against time level, nothing too groundbreaking. Next is Mars, and Backlash again. The nation sighs a collective sigh. Love that bit of sarcasm, sums up Backlash perfectly. They're talking about obliterating structures, and you're supposed to tackle the level widthways, getting a run-up before trenches, and sailing over the midsection. Mid-air corrections are possible, apparently. And Backlash skids, which they admit is only sporadically useful. Yeah, Backlash, always a bit of a handful. Venus is next, divided into quarters with crates. Be fast and precise to get gold, and you get lumbered with the Backlash again. This is not a good thing, they say, again spot on. Backlash on a precise level? Good luck with that. Chorus. Finally, Neptune, the last of the space levels, and another race like Mercury. Hit the jump right, follow the dark blue path through the greenish-white areas. Sounds fairly straightforward for Blastcore anyway. Warren June. Then at the bottom, they're talking about getting gold medals on every level. If you manage that, you unlock gold time attack, and then platinum time attack, which they say is frankly mad. Apparently you have to do Skyfall in 3 seconds in platinum time attack. 3 seconds! They finish off with, N64 Magazine wishes you the best of luck, because, quite honestly, you're gonna need it. Cheeky sods, but they're probably right. Blastcore, eh? Properly tough game, but oddly satisfying when you finally cracked it. This page from an old N64 mag, looks like it's issue 8, takes us right back to the days of the Nintendo hotline. Remember that? If you were stuck on a game, you could actually phone someone up and ask for help. Mad, isn't it? This page is basically saying, if you've got a gaming problem, don't be shy, give them a ring, and if they get loads of folks asking the same thing, they'll print the answers here for everyone. Utn. There's a little article at the start about some of the hotline crew getting dragged out to the ECTS show in London. Sounds like they were blinking a bit in the daylight after being stuck in the office all day, bless 'em. Apparently Nintendo had a big stand there, showing off all the latest stuff like GoldenEye 007. Remember the hype for that? Mario Kart 64, of course? And some Challenger vehicle, whatever that was. They mention a version of Extreme G and Top Gear Rally too. They were trying to get us excited about the N64, weren't they? They even mention a gorgeous gaggle of girls. Bit cheeky for a gaming mag, even back then. Then there's a section explaining what the hotline actually is, in case you were daft enough to not know. Apparently, they're a crack team of expert players ready to rescue us from gaming despair. Open 7 days a week, taking thousands of calls. Gives you the phone number, something like 017-036-52222, and their opening times, in case you wanted to call them up instead of actually trying to figure a game out yourself. Luxury, Warrington, Dolway. The rest of the page is all about 10 common questions, but they've only printed 4 here. All of them are about Blastcore. Of course it is, everyone was playing Blastcore back then. First question is about getting the J-bomb on Argent Towers. The answer is to use the backlash truck to smash some buildings, then use the ramdozer to shift a TNT crate and blow open a door. Then you nick a train. Classic Blastcore gameplay really, smashing stuff up with ridiculous vehicles. There's a picture showing the backlash and ramdozer doing their thing, and even a little smiley face icon which apparently tells you you're in the train. Righto. Next up, it's about finding the scientists in Blastcore. Apparently they are hiding on loads of levels like Argent Towers, Tempest City, Ironstone Mine, Ebony Coast, Glory Crossing, and a couple more. Another picture shows a scientist bloke looking like he needs a hand. Cheeky scientists, always hiding. The third question is how to get to the planets after the moon level in Blastcore. Turns out, you need to get a gold medal on every single course, main and secondary. Every single one. Typical Nintendo making it properly hard. If a course is circled in green, you've missed a communication tower, so tough luck, go back and get that gold medal. Screenshot shows a gold medal score, just to rub it in. Finally, the last question is a real simple one. How to erase your game on Blastcore. The answer is to hold start when you turn the N64 on, and you get an erase data screen. Choose yes, and poof, your save games are gone. Easy peasy apparently. Screenshot of that screen as well. Guess, data screen. So yeah, that's the Nintendo hotline page from back in the day. All about getting help with your games, especially Blastcore it seems. Those were the days, eh? Phoning up for game tips. Imagine that now. This page is a proper blast from the past, innit? It's one of those tips pages from an old N64 magazine, back when you actually had to ring a phone number to get cheat codes. Remember that? Good times. Ha, so what's on here? Right at the top, proper big letters, hotline, and a phone number 017-036-52222. Bet that number doesn't work anymore. It's all about getting your gaming questions answered, and they've got a few lined up here. First off, someone's asking about expert mode in Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as some of us might know it. Apparently you gotta get medals on all the levels to unlock it. Seems like a right grind for expert mode, doesn't it, Wars? Then there's someone stuck on Wet Dry World in Super Mario 64, with that pesky bomb buddy. They explain 3 different ways to get past it. Fair play, they've really gone into detail there, haven't they? Triple jumps, swimming about, sounds like a bit of a faff to be honest. Another Lilac Wars question, this time about versus mode vehicles. Apparently you can get Landmaster tanks, and even run around with bazookas, if you're good enough. Bazookas on foot. Sounds a bit mental, doesn't it? They also list the medal requirements for each Lilac Wars level. Aquas, Area 6, Boise, Corneria, all the usual suspects. Remember trying to get all those medals? Pain in the backside sometimes. No sneaky shooting down of Slippy? Ha! They got a sense of humor, these magazine folks. Someone struggling with outrage mode on Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. The answer is basically, tough luck mate, the cheat you heard about isn't real. Bit harsh, but fair enough. Then there's a classic, what am I doing wrong, about a simple cheat. Turns out, the cheat they tried isn't even a thing. Simple cheat you've mentioned doesn't exist, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Blunt, but to the point. Right, under the heading, UVVER stuff, what we know. That's proper cheeky, isn't it? It's all about cheat codes. First up, Hexen 64. Loads of button combos to unlock, cheat menu, God mode, clipping, and loads of other bits and bobs like all keys and all artifacts. Good if you were stuck, I suppose. Then, there's War Gods. Remember that game? Bit of a Mortal Kombat ripoff, wasn't it? They've got cheats for that too. cheat menu, P1 and P2 skill, level select, game timer, and even easy fatality. And you can play as Grox or XOR. They even give you the button sequences, down, down, right, left, left, up, right, down, for XOR for example. You had to press these things in on the character select screen apparently. You should hear the confirmation phrase, all too easy. Classic. And lastly, someone's asking about the toasty guy in Mortal Kombat Trilogy. They say when you're on the Starbridge stage you press down and start at the same time to fight Chameleon. Cool, they say. Yeah, I suppose it was kinda cool at the time. Milligay. Overall, it's a proper snapshot of the N64 days, relying on magazines for tips and cheats. Before the internet made it all too easy, eh? These pages were gold dust back then. This page depicts a tips extra section from N64 Magazine. Looks like issue 8. It's all about the top 5 tips for N64 games. Proper blast from the past this is. Porreleda. First up is Turok, Dinosaur Hunter the Big Cheat. They're banging on about a cheat code. NTH, GTH, DGD, CRTD TRK. Which is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Apparently it gives you everything. All weapons, infinite ammo, and warps to all levels. Sounds like it could ruin the game if you used it all the time, but may be handy for a quick blast. Next is Shadows of the Empire Be a Bad Guy. This one's for playing as an ATST. In the second round of the Battle of Hoth, you have to enter your name as _Wampa__Stomper_, with the underscores and everything a bit fiddly, but back then we were used to that. Remember Shadows of the Empire? Decent Star Wars game, but not quite as good as some of the movie stuff, was it? Still, stomping rebels in an ATST sounds like a laugh. Worry. Then there's Mario Kart 64 Turbo Start. Ah, the classic Turbo Start. Everyone knew this one, didn't they? Hit the accelerator halfway between the second and third lights. They're saying it's fundamental, and they're not wrong. Getting that turbo start was crucial for a good race, especially against your mates. Number 4 is Wave Race 64 Dolphin Ride. This one's a bit different. It's a stunt sequence rather than a cheat. You're supposed to do a bunch of tricks on a dolphin in stunt mode in Dolphin Park Championship. Handstand, backflip, barrel roll, the works. Sounds like a right show-off move, but Wave Race was always good for messing about in, wasn't it? Dolphin Park, those were the days. Corinche. Finally, Pilot Wings 64, driving across the USA. This is a funny one. Land the gyrocopter on a long road and you can apparently drive it like a car. They even say, like a car. It's completely pointless and just for novelty value. But they reckon it winds up people in the office when you hit a bump and shout, chitty chitty bang bang. Typical office banter, eh? Secca. Below the tips, there's a Your Top Tip box where they're asking for reader submissions for cheats and tips. If they use yours, you get a pin badge. And if you get the number 1 slot, you get something special. They even say, don't send us stuff we've already printed though. It makes James cross. Poor James. There's a form to fill in to send your tip in, with boxes for game name, tip details, your name, address and postcode. You have to send it to Tips Extra, N64 Magazine, 30 Monmouth Street, Bath, BA12BW. Crikey. Bath. Posh. They even say you can photocopy it if you don't want to cut up your magazine. Sensible that. Wouldn't want to ruin your precious N64 mag, would you? Good times. This page depicts a typical page from an old N64 magazine, probably from around 97, looking at the games on offer. At the top there's a reader's top 10 tips section, which is always good for a quick cheat or shortcut. It looks like a few Mario Kart 64 tips in there, which is no surprise as everyone was playing that back then. One tip is about cutting corners on Toad's Turnpike, and another is about getting ahead on Yoshi Valley. There's also something for ISS 64, the football game, about getting free fouls, and a Shadows of the Empire tip about taking down an IG-88. Star Fox 64 gets a mention for bonus points, and unlocking Starwolf drones in training mode. Clever stuff. Doom 64, remember that? Yeah, there's a tip for that involving giant brown monsters and blue orbs. Sounds about right for Doom. Pilot Wings 64 also gets a look in with a tip about shooting a passenger cruiser for points in Cannonball Level 2, never tried that one. Finally, there's a philosophical tip for you about being of the game, not in the game. Deep man deep. Below the tips section there are adverts for games and hardware from Software First. They've got Mario Kart 64, Killer Instinct Gold and Super Mario 64 highlighted with prices, around the £50 mark each, which seems about right for brand new N64 games at the time. Then there's a big list of N64 titles, all the usual suspects are there: Banjo-Kazooie, Blast Corps, Body Harvest, Conker's Quest, Doom 64 again, Duke Nukem 64, GoldenEye 007, Hexen, Jet Force Gemini, Killer Instinct Gold again, Legend of Zelda 64, Lilac Wars Star Fox 64, yeah, they're calling it Lilac Wars here for some reason. Madden NFL, Mario Kart 64 yet again, Mission Impossible, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, NBA Hangtime, Pilotwings 64, Quake 64, Shadows of the Empire, Super Mario 64, Turok Wave Race 64, Wayne Gretzky Hockey, Yoshi's Island 64 and more, a proper who's who of N64 game. On the right, there's a hardware and accessories section. They've got Nintendo 64 consoles in packs with Mario Kart or Super Mario 64, Shadows of the Empire, and International Superstar Soccer 64. Then there are standalone consoles and Wave Race packs. Loads of controllers in different colors, green, red, yellow, black, blue, all for around £28, £29. Memory packs, rumble packs, carry cases, steering wheels, even mouse mats and wrist pads with N64 logos on them, all the bits and bobs you could ever want for your N64. Seems like they've got pretty much everything covered if you wanted to kit yourself out. At the bottom there's contact info for software first, phone and fax numbers, email and website. It's a proper mail order setup. Pre-internet shopping days really. You'd have to phone them up, or send off a form in the post to order anything. Old school. This page from N64 Magazine writes, it's all about proving you're the best on the N64. Classic stuff from back in the day when we were all obsessed with getting our names in print. They're still getting loads of letters, bless them, proper snail mail and all for the tips section, and they reckon N64 owners are the most dedicated gamers out there. Which, yeah, we probably were. They're talking about Mario Kart 64 entries being the main thing, all those no-holds-barred races causing chart chaos. But they're also wondering about Star Fox and Turok. Were we all just Mario Kart mad, or were there any other games people were good at? They're even challenging someone called Stuart Richards and others to step up their game. Bit cheeky that. Hassan. Star performance this month goes to a Tommy Earl for his frappy Snowland time in Mario Kart, and they're even questioning if he cheated with a shortcut, but saying it's the best cheat time they've seen. Proper old school magazine banter, that is. They're even asking people to send in their shortcut times, maybe they'll have a mini-league for it. Then you've got the high score tables for Super Mario 64 and Wave Race 64, both American and Japanese versions, and PAL, for different stages like Foot Race with Cooper the Quick, Peach Slide and Sunny Beach. Loads of names listed, like GK from Darlington, who seems to be pretty good at Mario 64. Shows you how seriously some people took these games back then. Didn't we all want to be on that list? Don Warrington. There's also a new high score bit for the Koopa Troopa Challenge in Mario Kart 64. Someone called James Watt from Higham is top of the leaderboard now with a time of 1 minute 42 and 66, which is alright I suppose. They're giving away a SharkPad Pro controller as a prize, which was the must-have pad at the time if you were serious about your N64. You had to send in your entries by November 7th, calling it My Koopa Troopa Triumph. It's all a bit of harmless fun really, getting us all to play these games even more to try and be the best. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine issue 8 looks like it's the Club 64 letters page, back when we actually wrote letters to magazines. At the top, there's a bit of a preamble about the world of the N64 being mysterious, and the magazine trying to make sense of it all for us diligent readers. You know, back when screenshots in magazines were all we had before the internet properly took off. Then there's the Write to Us bit with the address for sending in your letters, very official. The first letter is titled, A Bad Name, from a Gary Lockheed, who went to a shop in York to check out the N64, and was shown a Super Mario World demo on the SNES, instead of Super Mario 64. Bless him. Ed, who I guess is the editor, or someone, replies with some classic sarcasm about raising his leg in the air. Next up is Important Revelation, where someone called Ed praises N64 Magazine for being the only mag they read cover to cover, even articles on games they're not that interested in, like Wayne Gretzky and Forsaken. Bit random that, but each to their own. Then there's Keep Quiet from Mr. Andrew Mills, who apparently is a time trial fiend for Mario Kart 64 and Pilotwings 64, and this reader is getting a bit wound up about it, suggesting Andrew needs to get out more. Ed's reply is again sarcastic, but in a playful way, about sending Andrew out with a camera to do something else. Funny Colors is a letter from Michael Hughes about the back of the Super Mario 64 box, showing different colors and things in Mario Kart 64 screenshots. He's noticed different colored Bowser, and only one power star in a screenshot. Ed explains it's pre-production pictures, which makes sense, those early screenshots were always a bit dodgy. Finally there's that thing from John Tang, who is asking about a feather in a Mario Kart 64 screenshot, wondering if it's like the feather from Super Mario World, and also a weird red box in Player 2's item box. Ed's reply is again about pre-production pictures, and admits they don't know what the red thing is, asking readers for suggestions. He even mentions that the feather was in early Mario Kart 64 but got ditched last minute, which is interesting to know now. Oh, and at the bottom left you can see the corner of the magazine cover for issue 8, with Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as it was known here, plastered all over it, alongside a mention of a Blast Corps guide. Good times. This page showcases the letters section of N64 Magazine. It's titled Dream On, which is quite apt as it's all about readers' game ideas and feedback. At the top there is a bit of banter about a Mario Kart cheat and someone called Juan being pipped to the post by Paul Williams. Sounds like classic playground bragging turn magazine fodder. The letters section starts with a funny one called Nothingness about the magazine getting smaller each issue. The reader is wondering if it's due to lack of games. Cheeky. Ed the editor replies with a classic British, it's the cold weather, you know how it is. Love it. Then there's a Dream On section where game developers are supposedly reading, and readers are pitching their dream games. Someone wants a Seiken Densetsu 3 remake. Now that's going way back to the Super Famicom days. That was a proper RPG. Never officially released here, I think. Someone else wants a single track racing game like Ridge Racer, but only one track, which Ed seems a bit unsure about, pointing to Diddy Kong Racing as a better example of track variety. Another reader is pitching Turok 3 set in New York with cars to blow up and dinosaur baddies. Sounds like a right laugh actually. And lastly, someone suggests a Batman RPG on the 64DD. Remember that add-on? Based on the animated series, viewed like Mario 64. Interesting idea. In the bonus letters section, there's a letter asking why ZY doesn't get pictured anymore, saying he worked hard on Mario, Pilot Wings, Killer Instinct Gold, and others. Apparently ZY is now camera shy. Ed says he runs away when a camera is pointed at him. Another letter is complaining about a cheap imitation of N64 Magazine, saying it makes them feel sick. Strong words. Someone else moans about Lilac Wars being a silly name, and suggests Star Force 64, or Star Pilot 64 instead. Ed's having none of it and just suggests anything. Then there's a reader baffled how people manage without Mario Wave Race and ISS 64, which is fair enough, those were crackers. Someone praises the Star Fox 64 review as the best ever, and another letter thanks them for a Star Fox 64 review too. Finally, there's a funny one about a reader sending in a pop-up Melissa George as a present, and Tim from the mag flicking an elastic band at it and knocking it down the side of his desk. Typical lads mag humor. This page from the magazine, right? It's the letters page. Invention Corner. Always a bit of a laugh this section, seeing what crazy ideas people come up with for the N64. This issue we've got Nathan from London suggesting lobbing a Game Boy screen into an N64 controller, calling it the Game Boy 64. Bit bonkers in it? Then there's Jason with the tilt pack, basically making the controller sensitive to tilting. They reckon it's ingenious, I suppose. It's a bit like those motion sensor things they have now. Ahead of its time really. And Barry's idea for a sticker printer for the N64, Print Club 64, scanning pictures and printing them out. Remember those sticker machines were all the rage then? Warrantor. Then we've got the reader letters. First up is Down the Chimney, about Super Mario 64. Someone suggesting using the coin count in the slides to pick lottery numbers, as if that's gonna work. They also suggest Mario Athletics games using the courses. A bit of fun with your mates, I suppose. Next section is Keychains, Ice Creams. Tim's moaning about Donkey Kong being everywhere. Key rings, ice creams, even Kellogg's cereal. Remember all that Donkey Kong stuff? He's saying it's overkill, trust the French to spot that, eh? Then Andrew is having a bit of a rant defending the magazine staff, saying they work hard and don't just play games all day, telling people to stop hassling Will for more covers. Bit of magazine drama there, bless 'em. Finally there's Don't Understand Kids. Jane's written in because Jeremy Davies moaned about parents not understanding games. She's saying parents do try to understand, but maybe they just don't get what's so great about them. Then she mentions her friend who's 29 playing N64, and she joins in with the games too. The age thing was different back then with games, wasn't it? It wasn't just for kids really, even though some people thought it was. Ed's reply at the end is funny, asking if she wants to be their collective N64 mum. Cheeky. This page in N64 Magazine issue 8, November 1997, it's the letters page. So tell me this, and your questions get tougher. Sections. Reading through the questions, it's all about the usual stuff gamers were wondering about back then. Someone's asking about using their SCART lead with a US N64, and if their monitor is compatible. Good old PAL versus NTSC worries. The magazine folks are pretty helpful, saying it should work but depends on the monitor. Older ones might be 50 or 60 Hz, newer ones are multi-standard. They also mention importers for US SNES consoles, and the Holy Grail, finding Final Fantasy II, which would have been a big deal if you were into your RPGs back then. Then there's the inevitable question about Super Mario Club in America, and if they still sell SNES games. Yes, they do, apparently. And someone's puzzled about Star Fox and Mario 64 endings, plus save game issues with converter carts. All very relatable techie questions. Over on the Your Questions Get Tougher side, someone's asking about a Nintendo Museum game on PlayStation Cheeky. The Mag guys are having none of it, saying Nintendo aren't likely to do that. There's a question about Sega Black Belt game, which is apparently called Sega Saturn Black Belt, and some chat about point-and-click adventures being a bit old hat now, with Zelda and Holy Magic Century being the big games at the time. Loads of game release date questions, always the burning question back then before the internet was everywhere with release info. Mario Kart 64 versus Diddy Kong Racing is a hot topic. Should you wait for Diddy Kong Racing in November? They think Mario Kart 64 is great but reckon Diddy Kong Racing could be something special. There's a question about American versions of games running slower. They say only Nintendo do that and they are a bit odd. They also mention Kylat Wars is full screen and almost full speed, which is good news for Star Fox fans. Banjo-Kazooie is mentioned as delayed. Shame that, everyone was looking forward to that one. Silicon Valley was also delayed, so a few disappointments there on the release front. Basiakas. There's a question about taking the label off the memory expansion pack, probably not a good idea if you want your guarantee to be valid. And typical Konami, keeping games close to their chest. They even mentioned Tiny Toons Wacky Sports, anyone remember that? And of course Doom 64 and Extreme G release dates are asked about. Finally someone's mate reckons he got the banana cup in Mario Kart 64. A bit of fibber maybe? The magazine guys think his trousers might be on fire. There's a screenshot of Mario Kart 64, with the 8th place and 1/3 laps done, showing Rainbow Road. Very colourful. Loading times for the 64DD are mentioned, shorter than CD games, that's interesting. Blast Corps and Lilat Wars are mentioned as potential next games after Mario Kart 64. And a question about the Jolt Pack. Sonic on the N64 is asked about. Never happened, did it? Clay Fighter 63 1/3 is named, a bit of a weird name, and they talk about MK Mythologies on Sub-Zero. Someone reckons the N64 can play SNES games, total rubbish of course, and a rumour of a new Sega console. Corrington Norcus. Right at the end, someone's asking about getting the best results making jam tarts, classic magazine stuff. Sue Overton, N64 Magazine's culinary advisor, chips in with some pastry tips, and there's the address if you want to write in yourself. All in all, a typical letters page full of questions and answers, and a good snapshot of what N64 gamers were thinking about in late 1997. This page is a bit of a coming soon teaser and index page from issue 8 of the N64 magazine. Right at the top it's shouting about GoldenEye, as if we didn't know it was going to be massive. Apparently they already reviewed the American version in the last issue, and gave it 94%, which sounds a bit generous if you ask me. But hey, what do I know? Issue 9 is promising to have all the info you need to avoid getting nabbed by the Spetsnaz, which is a bit dramatic, isn't it? Then it moves on to Extreme G, bragging about wipeout speeds. They reckon it's out in November, so we'll see if it lives up to the hype. Lamborghini 64 is also mentioned, saying it's like Top Gear Rally for tarmac racing, and they'll have a full review in the next issue. Duke Nukem 3D is finally making its way to the N64, apparently doing things in N64 magazine style, whatever that means. Clay Fighter 63 1/3 is in there too, something about Interplay's Beat 'em Up series continuing on the N64, and there's a mention of Mario Kart Championship results being published. There's a how-to section about scoring loads of points in Lilat Wars, which we all knew as Star Fox 64 in the end, and a slightly odd-sounding feature about making your N64 games good enough to eat. Bit strange. It also tells us that issue 9 is out on Friday, November 14th. On the right side, there's the index for issue 8. Loads of previews and reviews in there, as you'd expect. Banjo-Kazooie, Bomberman 64, Chameleon Twist, Conquest's Quest, Fighting Cup, Gasp, Gex, Hybrid Heaven, J-League Dynamite Soccer, GQ World Soccer 3, Lilat Wars, again, Mischief Makers, Multi-Racing Championship, NBA, In the Zone 98, Space Circus, Space Jelly, Tonic Trouble, Top Gear Rally, Virtual Chess, and Weetrix. Blimey, they were busy. Features-wise, there's stuff like An Ear to the Ground, An Englishman in Tokyo, Dream On, Earthworm Jim 3D, Future Look, Game Japan, Games Master News, Help Wanted, How-to Guides for Blast Corps and Mario Kart 64 Battle Mode, I'm the Best, Invention Corner, Lilat Wars Championship Bits and Pieces, N64 Arena, Nagano Winter Olympics Future Look, New Goods, Nintendo Hotline Retro World, San Francisco Rush Future Look, So Tell Me This, subscriptions, tips and ultra release list, and something about winning N64 goodies. Seems like a packed issue, alright. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 8, November 1997, is all about racing, it seems. The big headline game is F1 Pole Position 64. Looks like Ubisoft were trying their hand at a Formula 1 game on the N64. They're boasting about it being the most authentic Formula 1 experience, with all the teams and drivers from the 96 season, plus 16 tracks. I remember those early 3D races. They were a bit blocky looking back, but at the time we were blown away by it all. Bell. On the right there's a reviews this issue section. Lilac Wars, which we all know is Star Fox 64 over here in the UK, and Top Gear Rally. Lilac Wars was a proper classic, everyone was buzzing about that one. Top Gear Rally, I remember that being alright, not exactly Gran Turismo but a decent rally game, for the N64. There's also a list of other reviews in this issue, quick mentions for Bomberman 64, Lamborghini 64, some Japanese football games called J-League Dynamite Soccer, and JICU World Soccer 3, and Mischief Makers. Mischief Makers, now that was a bit different, Shake, me EJ. Under other great stuff, it looks like they've got articles on a Lilac Wars Championship, a guide for Blastcore, that game was mental, all about demolition and driving diggers around, good fun. Mario Kart Battle Mode guide is there, everyone loved a bit of Mario Kart Battle. Then just some general tips, high scores, a preview of the Nagano Winter Olympics game, must have been getting ready for the 98 Olympics, and then some bits about importing games, sell, and win a heap of import games, that was always tempting, getting games before they came out here, if you could afford it. Good times reading through these mags back then, seeing what was new and what was coming up.